Hi friend, I'm really glad you found your way back here tonight. Before we start, let me ask you something, and I want you to really sit with it for a second. What if some of the people you love most right now in this very moment are only here today because a small child in the snow was loved so much that grown adults broke their hands carving him a crown? Not gold, ivory. And that little crown would end up rewriting the story of half the planet, including quite possibly your part in it. Stay with me tonight, because by the time this story's over, you may never look at your own family the same way again. You might even find yourself wondering quietly what small object someone might one day bury with you. Okay? Before we step into the cold together, a small favour only if you feel like giving it. If quiet, strange, deeply human stories like this one are your kind of thing, tapping that like button, leaving a little comment, or sticking around as a subscriber helps this channel more than you probably think. But only if you truly mean it. I am not going to guilt you into it, I promise. That is not the kind of friend I want to be tonight. And I am curious about something. Where are you tonight? Already under the blankets? Half asleep on the couch with the television glowing quietly in the dark, hiding from your family in the bathroom because it is the only quiet room left in the house. Tell me down in the comments. I go through every single one and I love knowing exactly who is out there in the dark with me tonight. Alright, dim the lights if you can. Maybe let a soft fan hum somewhere in the background, just enough noise to make the silence feel a little gentler. Get comfortable, because tonight we are not just hearing a story, we are going back. 24,000 years back, to be exact, to a world that does not even have a name yet. Picture it with me for a moment. There is no such thing as a house yet. No wheels, no writing, no maps of any kind. Somewhere on this frozen earth, in a place that will one day be called Siberia, there is only white in every direction, and cold air sharp enough to make you question every single decision that led you outside your shelter tonight. This is the middle of an ice age, not the cartoon kind with clubs and grunting, a real one. Glaciers thick enough to bury mountains whole. Herds of woolly mammoths moving like slow furry islands across a plain of frozen grass that stretches further than anyone alive has ever walked. Above it all on the clearest nights, the sky sometimes catches fire in green and violet light, curling and folding over the darkness, like something alive older than any of the stories we tell about it today. Scientists today even gave this frozen world its own nickname. They call it the Mammoth Steppe, and it might be the strangest, coldest paradise that ever existed on this earth. There is no birdsong here most of the year. No rustle of leaves, because there are barely any trees left standing this far north. Mostly there is cold air moving low over the snow and silence, and every once in a while the far-off call of animals that no longer exist anywhere on our planet today. You can hear your own breath out here before you hear almost anything else. It hangs in front of your face for a second, then disappears over and over like the smallest possible proof that you are for now still alive. And somewhere on that white plain near what people will one day call Lake Baikal, there is a fire. It is small. It has to be small because fuel out here is precious, and the people gathered around it know exactly how many hours a good fire can survive the night before it needs to be fed again. This is not a large group. Maybe a few families related by blood or by marriage sharing everything they own, because out here sharing is not generosity. It is simply how you stay alive until spring. Their shelter is not built from wood. There is barely any wood to find in a place like this. Instead, their home is built partly from the enormous curved bones and tusks of mammoths, stacked together like something out of an old legend and packed tight with frozen earth and hide to keep out the worst of the cold. Every scrap of ivory in this camp came from an animal that was hunted with nothing but sharpened stone patience, and a kind of courage most of us will thankfully never need to test. A single mammoth could feed a group like this for weeks. Its hide became shelter. Its bones became tools and walls and eventually art. Nothing here gets wasted ever, because out here waste is not careless, it is deadly. Which is exactly why giving away enough ivory to crown a child instead of turning it into a spear point or a needle tells you everything you need to know about how much he was loved. Do not picture these people as simple. That is the first mistake almost everyone makes when they imagine the deep past. These are not shuffling, grunting figures from an old black and white movie. They carve. They sew clothing tight enough to trap body heat in weather that would kill most of us within hours. They shape small, careful works of art out of ivory figures shaped like women, shaped like birds, shaped like the animals that keep them alive through the long winter. Inside that shelter tonight, an older woman is probably still working a piece of ivory down into a bead by hand, turning it over and over by firelight, the same slow, patient motion her own mother once taught her. Near the back of the same shelter, an old man hums low and almost tuneless, more breath than melody. The kind of sound people make when words feel too small for the moment. Nobody asks him to stop. They already understand something we sometimes forget in the modern world, buried under our comfortable beds and our climate-controlled rooms. Beauty is not a luxury out here. It is a survival skill for the soul, every bit as necessary as fire. Tonight, though, this particular fire is quiet for a different reason. A child has died. He is about 4 years old. We do not know his name. Nobody here writes anything down, so no name was ever recorded for him. Not on paper, not on stone, nowhere at all. But we know somehow exactly how much he mattered to the people standing around him tonight, and we know it because of what they choose to do next. They do not simply bury him and walk away. They dress him carefully like a small king going somewhere important. Around his small skull, someone places a diadem, a kind of crown carved patiently out of mammoth ivory. Around his neck, they fasten a necklace made from hundreds of tiny beads, each one shaped by hand one at a time, with nothing but stone tools and an almost unbearable amount of patience. If you have ever strung a simple bracelet for someone you love, multiply that afternoon by 100, and you will start to understand what a gift like this actually costs in a world without shortcuts. And just beside his body they place a small pendant carved gently into the shape of a bird wing slightly open, as if it might carry something upward. Sit with that for one moment. In a world with almost nothing to spare, where every single hour goes toward finding food and staying warm enough to simply see morning, somebody still sat down, probably for days, and shaped hundreds of tiny beads for a child who would never wear them anywhere except into the frozen ground. That is not survival. That is love doing what love does best, refusing to let go quietly even when the world gives you every reason to. We do not know who knelt beside him that night. Maybe it was his mother. Maybe it was an older sister or a grandfather who'd already buried too many little ones in his long life to count anymore. We were not there, and honesty matters more than drama in a story like this one, so I will not pretend to know things nobody can truly know. But I think it is safe to say that somewhere in that firelight, somebody's whole world went quiet in a way that would feel painfully familiar to any parent watching this video tonight 24,000 years later, on a screen that would look like pure magic to everyone sitting around that fire. Grief, it turns out, does not need language to be real. It never has. You've probably felt it yourself standing in a funeral home somewhere staring at a small item that meant nothing to the rest of the world, and absolutely everything to you. A ring, a worn-out sweater, a child's drawing kept in a kitchen drawer for 30 years. We are, it seems, exactly the same kind of creature we were 24,000 years ago. We just trade mammoth ivory for other small, stubborn objects now. Here is something we do know, though, and it is almost impossible to sit with once it settles in. That child would stay exactly where he was placed for 24,000 years. Let that number breathe for a second, because it is almost too large to hold in your mind all at once. Entire empires would rise on the other side of the planet and crumble back into dust, and be completely forgotten while he slept undisturbed beneath the frozen ground. The mammoths outside his resting place, the very animals whose tusks became his crown, would vanish from the earth altogether, hunted and pushed out by a warming world they never saw coming. The ice itself would slowly loosen its grip on the planet inch by inch, century after century. Forests would grow where there had only ever been ice. Rivers would carve entirely new paths across the land above him. Far to the south and west of his grave, people would slowly learn to press seeds into soil on purpose, instead of simply gathering whatever grew wild. Someone would invent the wheel. Someone else in a completely different corner of the earth would press the first written marks into wet clay, just to remember how much grain was owed to whom. Villages would swell into cities, and cities would rise and burn and rise again in different shapes with different names. Wars would be fought over borders that did not even exist yet as anyone's idea of a country, and this small nameless boy would not move an inch through any of it. The frozen ground that swallowed him also happened to protect him, sealing his resting place away from the world almost perfectly, as if the earth itself had quietly decided to keep his secret a little longer and a little longer and a little longer still, until one day in a century he could never have imagined in a country that did not even exist yet, somebody would carefully lift him out of that same frozen earth, and without meaning to hand him one final job. Not as a king this time, as a witness. He was about to become one of the most important witnesses in a mystery involving nearly every human being alive on the planet today, including quite possibly you, sitting right there listening to my voice in the dark, wrapped in a blanket that this boy's people never lived to imagine. Hidden inside his small fragile bones was a message that had nothing to do with ivory or beads or any language ever spoken out loud. It was written in something far older and far more stubborn than words, something that survives fire and flood and 24,000 winters without complaint, quietly waiting for someone smart enough, or maybe just patient enough to finally learn how to listen. Blood! The very same substance moving through your own veins right now as you lie there listening to me in the dark. Strange to think about, is it not? A 4-year-old boy, a crown made of tusk, a grave. Nobody was ever supposed to find, and somehow an invisible thread running all the way from his small chest to yours. But to understand what this quiet child in the snow was really about to tell us all these thousands of years later, we first need to slow down. We need to understand a little more about the strange, frozen, oddly beautiful world he actually came from, and the people who somehow found a way to build full, meaningful lives inside of it. Because the truth is, my friend, almost everything you think you already know about the deep past is about to get a lot more complicated in the very best way. And it all starts with the ground itself. The ice, the animals, the impossible frozen paradise this small boy called home long before it had any other name at all. So let's start with the ground itself, because most people, if they are honest, have the wrong picture of it in their head, completely myself included, before I actually started digging into all of this. When you hear the words Ice Age, what shows up in your mind? Probably something like an endless white desert snow piled up to the rooftops, maybe a couple of confused-looking cavemen wrapped in animal skins freezing next to a rock, possibly voiced by an actor doing a strange growling accent from an old cartoon. I want you to delete that picture completely, because it is almost entirely wrong, and the truth is honestly a lot more interesting. The world our nameless little boy was born into did have ice, plenty of it, but the specific stretch of land he called home was not buried under snowdrifts. It was something scientists later gave a name so strange it sounds almost made up. They called it the Mammoth Steppe, Picture a grassland instead of a snowfield, cold, dry, windswept, and absolutely enormous. At its largest, this single ecosystem stretched from what is now Spain all the way across Europe and Siberia, through a strip of land that would later disappear underwater and into Alaska and the Yukon in modern-day Canada. Put another way, one continuous belt of frozen grass connected the coast of the Atlantic Ocean to the edge of North America. If you tried to drive across it today at highway speed without stopping, it would take you the better part of 2 straight weeks. And this was not some barren wasteland either. Researchers studying ancient pollen animal bones and soil layers now estimate this biome covered somewhere around 70 million square kilometers at its peak. For a sense of scale, that is larger than the entire continent of Africa. And it was not empty. Scientists comparing the density of animal life here to modern ecosystems have found that the mammoth steppe supported roughly as much wildlife per square mile as the African savanna does today. Bison, horses, reindeer, woolly rhinoceros, and of course mammoths moving across the grass in numbers that would make a modern nature documentary look quiet by comparison. It was not exactly a peaceful place either. Cave lions, noticeably larger than the African lions we picture today, hunted across these same plains. So did cave hyenas, and on occasion short-faced bears powerful enough to challenge almost anything else standing in their path. Somewhere out there too wandered giant deer with antlers stretching nearly 12 feet from tip to tip, an animal so strange-looking that if you saw one crossing the road in front of your car tonight, you would probably assume you were dreaming. Now imagine stepping outside your mammoth bone shelter in the dark alone to check on a noise. I will let you sit with that feeling for a second. So why does everybody still picture cavemen shivering next to a single sad fire in an empty white void? Honestly, probably old movies and a very human habit of assuming anyone who lived a long time ago must have been simpler than us. It is a comforting story, I think, because it lets us feel like progress only moves in one direction, always upward with us conveniently sitting at the top. The problem is, it just is not true. Here is the part that surprises most people. The mammoth steppe was cold, brutally cold, but it was also dry. Not the deep, soft, powdery snow you picture from a postcard of the Alps. Think instead of the high plains somewhere like Montana or Wyoming in the dead of winter. Wind scoured frozen solid, but with grass still visible poking up stubbornly through a thin crust of frost, rather than buried under 10 feet of snow. That dryness actually mattered enormously, because it meant grazing animals could dig down and still find food through the coldest months, which meant predators, and the humans who hunted alongside them, always had something to eat if they were skilled enough to catch it. Here is a question for you, and I actually want you to think about it for a second instead of just scrolling past it in your head. If you were dropped into that world tonight with nothing but the clothes on your back, how many days do you think you would survive? Be honest with yourself. I will go first. I would probably last about an afternoon, and even that is being generous to myself. The people who actually made their home there, though, were not improvising their way through each day. They were running one of the most refined survival systems our species has ever developed, and some of what they invented has never really left us since. Take something as small as a sewing needle. Somewhere around 40,000 years ago in exactly this part of Siberia, someone took a sliver of bone or antler, and instead of just sharpening it into a simple hide-piercing tool, they drilled a tiny eye through one end of it. That small hole changed everything. Suddenly clothing could be stitched instead of just wrapped and tied. Seams could be sealed tight against the cold. Layers could be built, fitted and shaped to an individual body instead of a rough general size. Researchers who study this period now believe these needles were not only about staying warm either. Some of the earliest ones show signs of being used to sew on beads and decorations, which means roughly 40,000 years before anyone invented a shopping mall. Humans in this exact region had already invented fashion. Not because they needed to impress anyone at a party, because looking good, expressing who you were through what you wore, turned out to matter to us almost as much as staying alive did. Somewhere a modern fashion executive is probably relieved to learn their entire industry has a 40,000-year head start on the concept. Personally, I find it a little comforting. It means the urge to put on your favourite outfit before a night out is not vanity. It is practically ancestral instinct. And clothing was not the only surprise these people had waiting for us. Further west in what is now the Czech Republic at a site called Dolní Věstonice, archaeologists found something that for decades quietly broke the rules of what we thought we knew about human history. A small figurine shaped like a woman made not from carved ivory this time but from clay, and then deliberately fired in a kiln. It dates back roughly 29,000 years. For a long time, textbooks confidently taught that humans did not figure out how to fire clay into ceramic until thousands of years later alongside the invention of farming and pottery. This little figure sitting quietly in a museum drawer quietly proved every one of those textbooks wrong. Their homes tell a similarly surprising story. Wood, remember, was almost impossible to find out here, so people built with what the land actually gave them. In what is now central Ukraine, at a site called Mezhyrich, archaeologists uncovered something that still makes people stop and stare. 4 separate dwellings built almost entirely from mammoth bones. We're talking about roughly 150 individual bones and tusks per structure. Skulls stacked on skulls, tusks curving upward like the ribs of some enormous animal, turned inside out, carefully layered and fitted together into circular walls, strong enough to support a covering of hide against the worst winds on the planet. One of these structures, according to recent dating of small animal remains found inside it, appears to have been used repaired and lived in for nearly 400 years. Think about that for a moment. Not one family one winter, generations of families, returning to the same carefully built shelter, passing it down like an heirloom made of tusks. This was not a species barely holding on. This was architecture. Now I want to bring you somewhere else for a moment, still deep in this same frozen world, because there is a discovery that connects directly back to the boy we met earlier. And honestly, it might hit even harder. Quick question before we go there, and I mean this sincerely, not just as a rhetorical trick. Think of the most expensive, most sentimental gift you have ever given somebody you loved. Maybe it took you months to save up for. Maybe you made it yourself late at night, exhausted because you wanted it to be right. Hold that feeling in your mind for a second. You are going to need it. Near a city that would one day be called Vladimir in Russia, archaeologists found a burial site now known as Sunghir, dating back around 34,000 years. Among the graves there 2 children were buried together head to head, roughly 10 and 12 years old. And when I say buried, I mean it in the most staggering sense of that word. Between the 2 of them, archaeologists recovered more than 10,000 individually carved mammoth ivory beads, along with ivory armbands, pierced fox teeth by the hundreds, and long ceremonial spears carved from mammoth tusks, some of them stretching well over 2 meters in length. Do the math on that for a second. Researchers who have tried to estimate how long it takes to hand carve a single ivory bead, using only stone tools, suggest it could take nearly an hour each. 10,000 beads. That is not a quick gesture of grief. That is potentially years of collective labour from an entire community poured into honouring 2 children. And here is the detail that I think about more than almost anything else in this whole story. One of those 2 boys had bones that were unusually short and curved, a sign researchers believe of a significant physical condition he likely lived with his entire short life. In a world this brutally demanding a world where every single person's physical strength truly mattered for the group's survival, you might expect a child like that to be quietly overlooked. He was not. If anything, his grave is one of the richest ever found from this entire era of human history. I don't know about you, but that tells me something rather beautiful about who we've always been as a species underneath all the fur and the ochre and the cold. If you are a parent listening to this tonight, or maybe you're simply someone who has loved a child fiercely at some point in your life, I suspect a part of you already understood the Sunghir story before I even finished telling it. That specific, almost unreasonable urge to give a child everything, even when everything is not remotely necessary for survival, even when it costs you sleep money or your own two aching hands. It turns out that particular kind of love is not a modern invention either. It is stitched quite literally into 10,000 tiny beads buried in the frozen ground for 34,000 years. There is one more twist to the Sunghir story worth knowing. When scientists eventually studied the genetic material from the bodies buried there, they expected to find a tightly knit, closely related family group, the kind of small, isolated community you might assume was forced together by sheer survival. Instead, they discovered the people buried at Sunghir were surprisingly unrelated to each other, which suggests something remarkable. These groups were not small, inbred, isolated bands stumbling blindly through the wilderness. They were part of wide, deliberate social networks, likely trading partners and marriage partners across huge distances specifically to keep their bloodlines healthy. Somehow, without a single written record, a map or a calendar, small scattered communities across an entire frozen continent were managing to find each other, exchange people ideas, and probably a fair amount of gossip across distances most of us would not casually drive today. In other words, dating outside your immediate circle is not a modern invention. It might be one of the oldest survival strategies we have. Let's put all of this in perspective for a second, because I think the scale of it deserves an actual pause instead of just a passing mention. Stonehenge, that massive stone circle everybody has seen in photographs standing quietly in an English field, was raised roughly 5,000 years ago. The Great Pyramid of Giza, that impossible triangle rising out of the desert, was built around 4,500 years ago. Both of those already feel almost unreasonably ancient to us, do they not? Museums build entire wings around objects half that old, and yet the child we met earlier resting in his ivory crown beside Lake Baikal was already 19,000 years into his sleep beneath the frozen ground before the first stone of either of those famous monuments was ever lifted into place. If human history were a single day, and the pyramids were built at around 11 o'clock at night, our boy would have already been buried since sometime around lunchtime in an entirely different world that nobody currently alive has ever seen represented accurately in a single movie. So the next time someone casually mentions cavemen dragging their knuckles and grunting at each other, I would gently push back on that image. These were people who tailored their clothing, decorated their children, in the equivalent of family heirlooms, built multi-generational homes out of the bones of giants, and quietly worked out how to keep their communities genetically healthy, all while surviving conditions that would end most of our lives within a single week. They were not simpler than us. In some very real ways, out of pure necessity, they may have been more resourceful than most of us will ever need to become. Next time your heating breaks for one uncomfortable evening and it feels like a real crisis, maybe spare half a thought for the people who solved that exact problem permanently, using nothing but frozen grass, mammoth bones, and each other. But surviving that world is only half of this story, and honestly it might be the smaller half. Because for tens of thousands of years, everything we just talked about, the beads, the bone houses, the needles, the small clay woman fired in a kiln long before anyone thought that was possible. All of it sat frozen and forgotten, buried under layer after layer of soil nobody thought to look beneath. It took an unusually stubborn man working in a country still finding its feet, after a revolution digging in a spot most people would have walked straight past without a second glance, to finally start pulling this entire hidden world back up into the light. He had no idea, kneeling in that dirt with a small brush in his hand, that the boy he was about to find would eventually end up connected to almost everyone listening to this story right now. That part of the story, the part where science finally catches up to the past, is where we are headed next. That man had a name, and honestly, he deserves a proper introduction, because without him, this whole story might still be sitting quietly underground. His name was Mikhail Gerasimov, and in the year he made his discovery, he was only 21 years old. Not a professor, not someone with a wall full of framed degrees. He had started digging up the past as a young teenager, barely into his teens, if the old records are accurate, working his way up from an unpaid schoolboy intern at a small local museum in Irkutsk in southern Siberia to the head of its entire archaeology department, mostly through sheer stubborn curiosity and an ability to spot things other people walked straight past. His father was a doctor, and Gerasimov grew up surrounded by anatomy books and old bones, instead of toys, in a region that had only a few years earlier been torn apart by revolution and civil war. If you are picturing a quiet, comfortable childhood spent carefully cataloguing pottery shards in a warm study, I would gently steer you away from that image. This was a young man who came up hard in a hard place at a hard moment in his country's history, and somehow turned all of that into a career spent gently, patiently listening to the dead. In 1928, walking the banks of a small river called the Belaya, not far from a village that shared its name with the site he was about to uncover, roughly 100 kilometers from Irkutsk itself, Gerasimov noticed something in the exposed riverbank that most people would have dismissed as an unusual-looking rock. Rivers like this one are constantly cutting into their own banks season after season, quietly peeling back the earth like the pages of a book nobody has opened in millennia. Most of the time all the erosion reveals is mud and gravel. This time it revealed something else entirely. It was not a rock. It was the beginning of an entire buried settlement, one that had been sitting untouched under that soil for roughly 23,000 years, waiting in a sense for a sharp-eyed young man with almost no formal training to happen to be walking past at exactly the right moment in exactly the right decade. Over the following seasons, Gerasimov and the archaeologists who eventually joined him began pulling an astonishing amount of history out of that riverbank. Several semi-underground houses emerged first, their walls built from stacked mammoth bones and reindeer antlers, exactly the kind of resourceful architecture we talked about a little earlier, just built here independently by an entirely different community. Inside those houses they found something even more remarkable. Roughly 30 small carved figurines, most of them made from mammoth ivory, most of them shaped like women, ranging from tiny pieces barely the length of your thumb up to ones nearly the size of your hand. For a long time, historians assumed these figures were something like fertility idols, or symbols of an imagined goddess, exaggerated and generic, the same tired assumption made about almost every ancient female statue ever unearthed anywhere in the world. It became the accepted explanation for decades, repeated in textbook after textbook, mostly, if I am being honest, because nobody had a better one, and nobody had the tools to look closer. But here is where I want to pause and give you something recent, because this part of the story is honestly still unfolding, and I think it is one of the more quietly wonderful updates in this entire field. Within the past couple of decades, researchers went back to these same figurines with microscopes examining the surface at a level of detail Gerasimov himself never had access to in 1928. What they found quietly rewrote the textbook description. These were not generic idealized bodies at all. Faint worn lines on the ivory, nearly invisible to the naked eye, turned out to be carved clothing. Hats, footwear, bracelets. In a few cases, something that looks remarkably like a small bag or pack slung across the body. Some figures appear to represent children. Some appear to represent men. Different hairstyles show up under magnification individual as fingerprints. Ask yourself this for a second. If someone handed you a single carved inch of ivory and asked you to capture a real person in it, someone specific, someone you actually loved, what would you choose to include? What tiny detail would matter enough to spend hours carving with nothing but a stone blade? The people of Malta, it turns out, were not carving abstract fertility symbols at all. They were carving portraits, likely of people they actually knew, perhaps even, and I find this thought oddly moving, of specific relatives they wanted, remembered long after their own memories inevitably faded. There is one more detail from inside those houses worth sitting with for a moment. Archaeologists noticed the objects scattered across the floor were not scattered randomly at all. On one side of each hearth, tools for hunting and small carved birds were clustered together. On the opposite side, sewing tools, ornaments, and nearly all of the female figurines were grouped instead. In other words, 23,000 years ago, this small community appears to have organized their living space with a sense of order, of belonging, of this side is yours and that side is mine, that would feel oddly familiar to anyone who has ever negotiated closet space with a partner, or fought quietly over which side of the bed is whose. I do not think this means their world was rigidly divided the way certain old-fashioned museum plaques might suggest. I think it means something simpler and honestly a bit sweeter. These were not strangers randomly dropping their belongings on the ground. They were a household. And households in every era of human history I can think of tend to develop their own small unspoken systems, their own version of a junk drawer, their own particular corner where somebody's tools always end up. A short distance from Malta, at a related site called Buret, archaeologists later uncovered a handful more of these carved women, distinct enough in style that researchers still debate exactly how the two communities were connected, whether by blood, by trade, or simply by sharing the same harsh stretch of river valley. Either way, it tells you this was never just one isolated family scraping by alone in the wilderness. It was a small world with neighbours and shared customs and presumably its own share of local gossip. And then somewhere in the middle of all of this, Gerasimov's team found the child. You already know him. The small boy with the ivory diadem, the beaded necklace, the tiny carved bird resting beside him. He was not folklore. He was not a dramatized invention for the sake of a good story. He was lying exactly where his own community had placed him roughly 24,000 years earlier, and Gerasimov's careful excavation is the reason any of us know he ever existed at all. In the official records, this small nameless child would eventually be given a rather cold clinical label. MA1, 2 letters and a number for a boy who was once given a crown. Here is a question worth sitting with for a second. How would you want to be remembered, a name carefully spoken for generations, or an object important enough that strangers are still gently respectfully studying you tens of thousands of years later? I am honestly not sure which one is the greater honour anymore. Maybe you have your own answer already forming. I would honestly love to hear it. Whichever way you land on that one. Now, Gerasimov himself went on to experience an almost unbelievable second act, and I think it is worth telling you because it says something about how strange, layered and interconnected the story of studying human remains can become. After Malta, Gerasimov became fascinated by a much stranger question. Not simply what a skull could tell you about the past, but whether a skull could hand you back an actual face. He spent years developing a method for reconstructing the physical appearance of a person using nothing but their bare skull, carefully layering estimated muscle fat and skin thickness back on sculpting the result by hand. It sounds almost impossible closer to a magic trick than a science. And yet it worked well enough that his technique became the foundation of modern forensic facial reconstruction, the same general approach police departments and archaeologists still use today to give a face back to unidentified remains. Over the rest of his career, Gerasimov personally reconstructed the faces of more than 200 people. Medieval Russian rulers staring out from museum cases with faces nobody had seen in centuries. A German poet whose scattered bones he helped identify in a mass grave decades after death. Neanderthals given back a kind of stubborn weathered dignity most illustrations before him had denied them entirely. He rebuilt the face of Ivan the Terrible from a battered skull, pulled out of a Moscow cathedral, and in a career move that still sounds slightly unbelievable, Soviet officials sent him in the summer of 1941 to open the tomb of Tamerlane, the 14th century conqueror in the city of Samarkand. Local legend at the time warned that disturbing Tamerlane's resting place would unleash a terrible war. Gerasimov, a scientist through and through, opened the tomb anyway. Within days, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, launching one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Now, I want to be very clear here because I take history seriously, even the strange corners of it. I am not telling you a tomb curse started a war. Wars do not work that way, and reducing millions of real documented deaths to a spooky coincidence feels disrespectful to everyone who actually lived through it. What I find far more interesting is simply this. People have always needed stories to make sense of events too large and too frightening to otherwise process. A curse is easier to hold in your mind than the true tangled entirely human causes behind a war. I think that tells us something honest about ourselves, long before it tells us anything about tombs. And there is a small quiet irony sitting right at the centre of that story that I do not think gets mentioned enough. The same man who spent his career being blamed half-jokingly for supposedly waking an ancient curse had already spent years carefully, respectfully reawakening the faces of the actual dead one-patient skull, at a time with nothing more mystical than measuring tape modelling clay and an enormous amount of anatomical knowledge. If Gerasimov had any real power over the dead at all, it was never magic. It was simply expertise earned the hard way over thousands of quiet hours most people would never have the patience for. What strikes me most about Gerasimov, honestly, is the shape of his whole life. He spent his career giving faces back to the dead one careful skull at a time, and yet the small boy who started his entire journey, the one buried in ivory beside Lake Baikal, remained in the deepest possible sense a stranger to him. Gerasimov could tell you what MA1's world probably looked like. He could not tell you who MA1 was actually related to. He could not tell you whether the child's ancestors had walked out of Africa toward the east or the west. He could not tell you whether anyone alive today carried so much as a single trace of that boy inside their own body. And this, I think, is the point in the story worth pausing on properly, because it clears up a mix-up I see constantly in comment sections under videos exactly like this one. There is a difference between archaeology and something else entirely, and it is a difference most people never think about until a story like this one forces the question. Archaeology, the work Gerasimov did so brilliantly, can tell you what people built, what they wore, what they buried their children with, roughly when they lived, sometimes even how their households were organized down to which side of the fire belonged to whom. It reads the surface of the past extraordinarily well, the way a skilled detective reads a room, but it cannot decode blood. It cannot trace a bloodline across 24,000 years and thousands of miles connecting a single Siberian child to strangers on entirely different continents who have never heard his name. For that you need an entirely different kind of science, one that studies not artifacts, but the microscopic instructions folded up inside every living cell, a science that in 1928 simply did not exist yet, not even as a serious theory in anyone's imagination. So the boy went to sleep again, in a sense. His bones, his ivory crown, his tiny carved bird were carefully cleaned, catalogued, and eventually placed in the collections of a grand museum in what is now called St. Petersburg, alongside the delicate figurines his own community once carved by firelight. Somewhere in that same building, tourists still walk past gold-covered ceilings and paintings worth more money than most of us will ever see in our lives inside a palace once built for emperors, often without realizing that tucked away in a quieter wing sits something far older, and in its own way far more valuable than any of it. A 23,000-year-old ivory crown surrounded by the kind of imperial gold that everyone actually came to see, and somehow still managing to be the more remarkable object in the room. For decades, MA1 sat there quietly, studied, respected, occasionally photographed for a textbook, measured and remeasured by careful hands, but essentially silent. A puzzle everyone agreed was fascinating, and nobody yet had the right tool to actually solve. It would take almost a full century after Gerasimov first knelt in that riverbank for the right tool to finally arrive, and when it did, it would not come from an archaeologist with a small brush and a notebook. It would come from a laboratory, from machines Gerasimov could never have imagined, filled with people trained in a science that did not even have a name yet when he was alive. A team of scientists about to ask that small patient boy a question, far stranger and far more personal than anything anyone had thought to ask him before. Not what did you build? Not what did you wear? Not even what did you look like, the question Gerasimov himself would have asked without a second thought. Something far more intimate. Something written into every single cell of his tiny 24,000-year-old body, in a language nobody on Earth could understand yet in 1928. Who exactly are you related to? Who exactly are you related to? It is such a small question, only 5 words, and yet in 1928 not a single scientist alive on this Earth had any real way of answering it about a 24,000-year-old child. It would take well over 80 more years, 2 full generations of researchers, and a man about as different from Gerasimov as you could possibly imagine to finally arrive at an answer. Let me introduce you to him properly, because honestly, his own life story is nearly as strange as the boy's, and I promise you it will not sound like a typical scientist biography. His name is Eski Willerslev, a Danish scientist, and before you picture a pale academic hunched over a microscope, his entire life, I need to correct that image immediately. As a young man, long before any laboratory, Willerslev spent time living as a fur trapper, deep in Siberia, in a remote region called Yakutia, alongside local hunters learning to survive in conditions not entirely unlike the ones our frozen family from Malta once faced. He had an identical twin brother who grew up to become an anthropologist himself, and the two of them apparently spent their early careers wandering some of the coldest, most remote corners of the planet together, collecting artifacts and stories most Western scientists would never bother chasing down in person. His own father, apparently a rather strict and unusual man, had him and his twin brother swimming in ice water and running obstacle courses from the age of 6, convinced it would toughen them up for whatever life eventually threw at them. It seems to have worked in a fairly extreme way. I do not think most parents reading this would recommend that particular parenting style, and to be clear, neither do I, but it does explain a few things about the kind of man who later chose ancient Siberian permafrost as a career. Here is a small story about Willerslev that I think says more about him than any list of academic credentials ever could. While living among trappers in Siberia, local custom apparently required that if you killed a bear, You had to hang its head in a tree afterward as a mark of respect. Willerslev at the time decided to break that tradition and bring a bear's head home instead as a kind of trophy. According to his own later account, things went wrong for him almost immediately after. Bad luck, strange nightmares, one difficulty stacking on top of another. The trappers he'd been living with told him this was no coincidence at all. Every bear on earth, they said, would now know what he had done and would resent him for it. Now, I'm not telling you that story to suggest a scientist secretly believes in bear curses, and honestly, I doubt Willerslev would frame it that way himself either. What I find worth sharing is something a little different. A man capable of listening seriously to that story, of respecting it enough to let it sit uneasily with him for years afterward, rather than simply laughing it off as primitive superstition, strikes me as exactly the right kind of person to eventually go looking for a scientific truth, this strange, this old, and this easy for lesser minds to dismiss out of pure discomfort. Sometimes taking other people's version of reality seriously, even when you personally do not share it, turns out to be excellent training for taking reality itself seriously. Have you ever had a moment like that yourself, where a belief you did not personally hold still managed to quietly change how you moved through the world afterward? I would bet quite a lot of you have, even if you have never said it out loud to anyone. By his early 30s, Willerslev had built Denmark's very first laboratory, dedicated entirely to ancient DNA, and quickly became the youngest full professor in the country's history. Along the way, he also stumbled onto something almost nobody had considered possible before him. He realized that plain, ordinary soil mud pulled directly out of a riverbank or an old lake bed still holds tiny fragments of genetic material, shed by every plant and animal that ever lived, drank or died nearby, even long after every visible bone and every visible seed has completely rotted away. In other words, entire lost ecosystems, whole, extinct food chains, could potentially be reconstructed from something as unglamorous as a scoop of dirt. It is the kind of idea that sounds almost too simple to be groundbreaking right up until you realize nobody had thought to actually prove it before he did. In 2010, his team achieved something nobody on the planet had ever managed before. They sequenced an entire ancient human genome from a 4,000-year-old man belonging to the Sakat culture in Greenland. And here is the detail that still truly amazes me every time I think about it. They pulled that entire genome not from bone, not from teeth, but from a single preserved strand of human hair frozen in the Arctic tundra for 4,000 years. Think about that the next time you find one stray hair on your pillow in the morning. Apparently that is more than enough information to rebuild an entire human being's genetic story, assuming, of course, you have the right equipment, an enormous amount of patience, and absolutely no fear of contaminating a priceless sample with your own modern skin cells by breathing too near it. That single strand of hair, once fully decoded, revealed something nobody had expected, either showing that this particular Arctic culture had migrated out of Siberia along a completely separate path from the ancestors of most Native American and Inuit populations, arriving in the New World almost like a distant, disconnected cousin nobody previously knew existed. It was proof right out of the gate that Willeslev's methods worked, and that ancient genomes could actually rewrite migration maps nobody had thought to question before. Which brings us finally back to our small boy from Malta sitting quietly in that grand Russian museum we talked about earlier, having already survived Gerasimov's careful excavation, decades of storage, and roughly 24,000 winters before that. Willeslev's team requested access to his remains, hoping to attempt something considerably more ambitious than the Greenland project. Not a 4,000-year-old genome this time, something 6 times older. Researchers in this field have since discovered that not every bone in the human body holds onto genetic material equally well. A particular unusually dense bone tucked inside the inner ear, called the petrous bone, protects its genetic cargo far better than almost anywhere else in the skeleton, largely because it is so hard and so well shielded that bacteria have a much harder time getting inside to feast on it. Teeth work reasonably well, too sealed tight inside their own protective layer of enamel. For a sample, this old every single advantage mattered, and choosing exactly where on that small skeleton to sample from was itself a decision made with almost surgical care. Before I tell you what they found, you need to understand exactly how difficult a task like this actually is, because I promise you, it is nothing whatsoever. Like the mail-order genetic testing kits many of you have probably spat into yourselves. When you die, your DNA does not simply sit there patiently intact, waiting politely for someone to decode it thousands of years later. It breaks down. Enzymes inside your own cells start tearing it apart almost immediately. Bacteria and fungi in the soil around you finish the job over the following centuries. By the time a sample is 24,000 years old, what remains is not a neat readable strand of genetic code. It is closer to a shredded document torn into thousands of tiny scraps, some fragments barely 50 letters long scattered and mixed in with soil bacteria, and honestly an enormous amount of chemical noise. Imagine someone hands you the complete works of an author, but every single page has been run through a paper shredder mixed together with a truckload of shredded newspaper from 100 other sources and left out in the rain for good measure. Your job is to somehow piece together the original manuscript anyway, using nothing but a computer, an extraordinary amount of statistical modelling, and a level of stubbornness most of us reserve for arguments we already know we are losing. That, roughly speaking, is what Willeslev's team was attempting with a boy who'd been in the ground since before the last ice sheets finished retreating. And unlike a normal shredded document, there was no original copy sitting safely in a drawer somewhere to check their work against. Whatever they managed to piece back together would be by definition the very first time in human history anyone had ever understood it. And that is only half the problem. The other half is us. Every single person who has ever touched that bone since it came out of the ground, every archaeologist, every museum curator, every well-meaning researcher who picked it up for a closer look decades before modern contamination protocols existed, potentially left behind traces of their own entirely modern DNA. Remember all those decades our boy spent quietly sitting in that grand Russian museum, studied and occasionally handled between Gerasimov's era and Willeslev's arrival. Every single one of those respectful, careful hands was also without meaning to be a potential contamination risk. Ancient DNA laboratories today operate with a level of paranoia that would make a hospital operating room look relaxed by comparison. Full body suits. Positive air pressure rooms specifically designed to keep outside air and outside skin cells from drifting in. Every single surface treated as if it were actively trying to sabotage the results, because in a sense it is. Researchers in this field will tell you half joking and half completely serious that their own DNA is the single greatest threat to their careers. Sneeze at the wrong moment and you have not just ruined your own morning, you have potentially contaminated a sample that took years and an enormous amount of funding to obtain in the first place. Here is a question for you, honestly, because I think about this one a lot. If you knew that a single stray eyelash falling into a sample could quietly ruin years of careful work, would you have the nerve to work in a lab like that every single day? I am not sure I would. My own hands shake enough just trying to thread a needle. So with all of that context in mind, imagine the moment Willeslev's team finally managed to extract a usable amount of genetic material from our small boy and began reading his mitochondrial and Y chromosome results for the very first time. Quick, simple explanation before we go further, because these terms get thrown around a lot in this kind of story without ever actually being explained. Mitochondrial DNA passes down only through mother's mother to child, generation after generation largely unchanged for thousands of years, which makes it a wonderfully clean way to trace a maternal line far back into the past. The Y chromosome works the same way, but strictly through father's son to son. Think of them as two separate, remarkably stubborn threads. One following your mother's mother's mother all the way back, the other following your father's father's father, both refusing to tangle with anything else along the way. And immediately something looked deeply wrong. The genetic markers coming back did not look Siberian at all. They did not particularly resemble the DNA patterns you would expect from ancient East Asian populations, either, despite the fact that this child had been buried squarely in the middle of Siberia, thousands of miles from Europe, separated by an ocean, and an entire continent from anyone who might explain such a result innocently. Instead, the markers looked unmistakably like something you would expect to find in a modern European person. You can probably guess what the team's very first assumption was, and honestly it was the responsible, scientifically correct assumption to make. Contamination. Somewhere along this boy's long journey from a frozen riverbank in 1928, through decades in storage handled by countless well-meaning researchers, before proper protocols existed, someone had almost certainly left behind a trace of their own European ancestry, and it was now hopelessly mixed in with his. Nobody wanted to publish a result like this without ruling that possibility out completely first. Careers and honestly the entire credibility of a very young scientific field were riding on getting this exactly right. Ancient DNA research had already been embarrassed once before years earlier by other researchers who published exciting-sounding results that later turned out to be nothing more than modern contamination dressed up as ancient discovery. Nobody at that lab wanted to become the next cautionary tale mentioned in someone else's conference presentation, so they went back. They resampled. They tested control samples from the surrounding soil, and from the researchers themselves cross-checking every possible source of modern contamination they could think of, looking specifically for a way to make this strange, uncomfortable signal simply disappear. Weeks of work quietly hoping to prove their own exciting result wrong, which is a very particular kind of professional discomfort most of us never have to experience in our own jobs. It refused to disappear. Sample after sample, test after test, the same unmistakable pattern, kept quietly returning stubborn, as the boy himself apparently was in the ground for 24,000 years. Whatever this signal actually meant, it was not a mistake sitting in a Copenhagen laboratory. It was something considerably older and considerably stranger than anyone on that research team had originally been prepared to accept. They now had a result nobody could explain away. What they did not yet have, not completely not in that exact moment, was any real understanding of just how much that single, small, stubborn result was about to rewrite. Not just the story of one Siberian child. The story of where an enormous number of people currently alive on this planet, quite possibly including you, actually came from. Somewhere in that Copenhagen laboratory, surrounded by clean air filters and a mountain of confusing data, a very small team of scientists was about to sit down, look each other in the eye and ask the only question left worth asking. If this boy really was not lying to them, if the contamination truly was ruled out for good, then who on Earth, or rather who across an entire planet, was he actually connected to? The honest answer, once they finally allowed themselves to say it out loud, turned out to be far stranger than any of them had walked into that lab expecting. The honest answer, once the team finally allowed themselves to say it out loud, came from a scientist named Manasa Raghavan, one of the principal researchers, actually running the numbers on this project, working alongside Willislev and a wider circle of collaborators scattered across universities on more than one continent. And I want to slow down here for a moment because what happened next is not really about a single dramatic headline. It is about watching a group of careful, skeptical people slowly realize they were holding something none of their existing categories could explain. It is worth remembering too that this was not a quick weekend project. The actual sample had first been carefully taken from the boys' remains at that same Grand Museum in St. Petersburg back in late 2009. It then took roughly 4 more years of careful, painstaking analysis, cross-checking and quiet internal doubt before the team felt confident enough to put their names on a result this strange and send it out into the world. 4 years is a long time to sit on a secret. You're not even completely sure you understand yet. Up to this point, everything we talked about last time involved fairly simple genetic markers, small individual threads passed down strictly through mothers or strictly through fathers. What Rogavan and her colleagues did next was something far more ambitious. They compared this boy's entire genome, every chromosome, hundreds of thousands of individual comparison points, against genetic data collected from populations scattered across the modern world. Not just a thread this time, the whole tapestry. Here is a simple way to picture what that actually looks like on a computer screen, because I think the raw statistics alone can feel a little cold and hard to hold on to. Researchers often turn genetic comparisons like this into something resembling a map, where every single person sampled becomes a single dot. People from similar backgrounds, similar ancestries naturally cluster together into little clouds. You get a cloud of dots representing modern Europeans sitting in one region, a cluster representing East Asians sitting somewhere else entirely, another cluster for Native American populations, another for sub-Saharan Africans, another for populations from Oceania, and so on, scattered across the page like a strange kind of family photograph taken from far, far above, where people who stand near each other in real life also tend to end up sitting near each other on the page. It is oddly satisfying to look at, honestly. Entire continents worth of complicated human history, quietly organizing themselves into tidy little neighborhoods, just from comparing strings of genetic letters. When they placed our small boy's genome onto that same map, something odd happened. He did not land inside any existing cluster at all. He was not sitting anywhere near the East Asian cluster, which honestly should have been the safest, most obvious bet given that he was buried practically in the geographic middle of Asia. He was not a tidy match for the European cluster either. Instead, he landed in a strange, mostly empty stretch of that map positioned almost exactly between the modern European cluster and the Native American cluster, closer to both of them than either group was to East Asians. The paper itself used a specific piece of scientific language to describe his position, calling him basal to modern Western Eurasians. That word basal is worth pausing on because it is doing a lot of quiet work in that sentence. Picture a family tree, the kind with branches splitting off again and again as generations pass. Basal simply means sitting near the very trunk of that tree before it ever split into the separate branches we would recognize today as, say, Northern Europeans or Southern Europeans or various populations of the Caucasus and the Middle East. MA1 was not a cousin standing on any one of those branches. He was standing somewhere near the trunk itself back before those particular branches had even grown apart from one another. Rogavan later described the reaction inside the research team in fairly understated scientific language, the kind researchers use when they're trying very hard not to sound as stunned as they actually are. The individuals she noted showed almost no meaningful genetic connection to the people living in that exact region of Siberia today, the very ground he'd been buried in for 24,000 years. Read between the lines of a sentence like that for a second, and you can practically hear a room full of scientists quietly setting down their coffee cups. Nobody in academia ever writes the sentence, "This is truly bizarre," and none of us can explain it in a published paper, no matter how badly they might want to. That is what peer review is apparently for. When the paper finally reached publication, it did something fairly rare in science. It did not just answer a single question about one Siberian boy. It quietly demonstrated that an entire generation of assumptions about human migration assumptions, comfortably repeated in textbooks for decades, had been built on incomplete evidence the whole time. Not wrong exactly, just incomplete the way a map missing one entire country can still technically get you most places right up until the moment you actually need to cross that particular border. Let's sit with how strange that actually is, because I do not think it gets enough credit for being strange. Imagine meeting someone whose entire family, going back for generations upon generations, has always lived in the exact same small town, and then discovering through nothing but their blood that they are not actually related to a single other person who has ever lived in that town, not their neighbours, not the family 2 houses down, nobody. And yet somehow they are closely related to people currently living on 2 entirely different continents, thousands of miles away in opposite directions. Would that not completely rearrange how you thought about that person's entire family history? That is roughly the puzzle this one small skeleton had just handed an international team of scientists. So what were they actually looking at? Stop and consider the geography for a second, because this is really where the whole thing stops making intuitive sense. Draw a straight line on a map from Malta to Beijing, and you will cover a shorter distance than driving from New York to Los Angeles. Draw that same line from Malta to most major cities in Western Europe, and you are looking at a considerably longer journey. Every ordinary assumption about how ancestry usually works, closer places tend to share closer bloodlines, said this boy should have looked at least somewhat East Asian. He simply did not. Geography in this particular case turned out to be an almost completely unreliable narrator. In the language population, geneticists eventually settled on MA1 appear to represent what is sometimes called a ghost population. I want to explain that term properly because it gets thrown around a lot online, often incorrectly, and it is honestly one of my favourite concepts in this entire field once you understand what it really means. A ghost population is not a population of actual ghosts, disappointingly. It refers to an ancient group of people whose genetic fingerprint clearly shows up inside many living populations, today spread out and diluted across generations of mixing, and yet whose own direct undiluted descendants appear to have vanished entirely. Nobody alive today is simply purely a member of this ancient group. Instead, small fragments of it are scattered everywhere, quietly folded into dozens of completely different modern populations, like a single ingredient stirred into 100 different recipes still technically present in each one, just never in its original isolated form anymore. You could spend your whole life eating meals made with that ingredient and never once taste it on its own. Before MA1 was sequenced, researchers had already begun suspecting something like this ghost population must exist purely from patterns they noticed while comparing modern human genomes to each other. It was a bit like detectives who were certain a particular getaway car existed based entirely on tyre tracks left at several different crime scenes, despite never once actually finding the car itself. They could describe its approximate size, guess at its general direction of travel, even estimate roughly when it must have passed through, all without a single photograph of the actual vehicle. MA1 was the moment that theoretical getaway car finally rolled into view, 24,000 years late, parked quietly in a Siberian riverbank, the entire time engine cold exactly where nobody had thought to look. And here is the number that for me is the real gut punch of this entire chapter of the story. Once the full analysis was complete, researchers calculated that somewhere between 14 and 38% of the ancestry carried by Native American populations today traces directly back to this exact ghost lineage. Not a rounding error, not a curious footnote buried in a supplementary table nobody reads. A substantial, measurable slice of an entire hemisphere's ancestry, hiding in plain sight for decades, simply because nobody had the right sample and the right technology in the same room at the same time until now. To put that range in perspective, think about how much of your own day-to-day identity might be shaped by even the smaller end of a number like that. Somewhere between roughly 1 in 7 and more than 1 in 3 pieces of ancestry across an entire continent's worth of indigenous peoples, quietly traced back to a small community of mammoth hunters huddled around a fire in Siberia. Not through legend, not through guesswork, through hard, repeatable statistical measurement. Before you get too far ahead of yourself here, and I know some of you already are, let me gently slow this train down for a second, because this is exactly the point in the story where things tend to get misunderstood and occasionally deliberately twisted. This does not mean Native Americans are somehow secretly European, and it does not mean Europeans and Native Americans are the same people wearing different cultural clothing. Please do not walk away with that idea. What it means is something both more subtle and honestly more beautiful than that. 24,000 years ago, somewhere in the heart of Siberia, there existed a population whose descendants eventually scattered in wildly different directions, some drifting west into what would eventually become Europe, others drifting east and eventually crossing into a continent that did not yet have a name. Over tens of thousands of years, each of those branches mixed extensively, with completely different populations along the way, absorbing new ancestry, developing new languages, new cultures, new identities entirely their own. A shared ancient root does not erase everything that grew on top of it since. If anything, I think it does the opposite. It shows just how much independent hard-won identity can grow from a single starting point, given enough time and enough distance. Think of it a bit like two cousins who moved away from the same small hometown as teenagers, one heading north, one heading south, and never once spoke again for the rest of their lives. Decades later, their grandchildren would have completely different accents, completely different lives, completely different everything, and would probably be baffled to discover they share a great-grandparent at all. The distance does not make the connection fake. It just means an enormous amount of independent, unrepeatable history happened on both sides of that split. I will admit this is exactly the kind of finding that occasionally gets hijacked by people online with an agenda. People looking for a scientific-sounding excuse to draw crude, ugly lines between groups of human beings or to claim some invented ancient superiority for themselves. You do not have to look very hard on the internet to find someone twisting a phrase like ghost population into something it was never meant to be. I want to be completely clear about where I personally land on that. Shared ancient ancestry is not a hierarchy. It is not a claim of ownership over anyone else's identity or history. It is simply a record written in blood instead of ink of how astonishingly interconnected our entire species turns out to be underneath all the borders we have since drawn on top of it. If a 24,000-year-old ghost population can quietly connect a farmer in modern-day Portugal to an indigenous elder in modern-day Peru without either one of them ever knowing it, I struggle to see how that fact could reasonably support anybody's claim of being somehow more special, more pure or more entitled than anyone else currently walking around on this planet. If anything, it argues rather strongly for the opposite conclusion. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment, honestly, not as a rhetorical trick. If you found out right now that a meaningful percentage of your own ancestry traced back to a single, specific, nameless person who lived 24,000 years ago, would that change how you see yourself at all? I am not entirely sure it would change mine, but I suspect it would at least make me pause the next time I catch myself thinking of any group of people as fundamentally permanently other. This ghost population eventually needed an actual name of its own, something a bit more dignified than a string of letters and a number. Researchers settled on Ancient North Eurasians, and once you know that name, you start seeing its fingerprints absolutely everywhere in the story of human migration, in places you would least expect them tucked into modern population studies most of us will never personally look through. But naming a ghost is one thing. Figuring out exactly how far its bloodline actually travelled, how many wildly different peoples ended up quietly carrying pieces of this one small forgotten community, turns out to be a much bigger story than a single chapter can hold. It stretches west into the story of an entire continent's ancestry being quietly rewritten, and east into a mystery involving two entire hemispheres nobody realised were connected at all. And it starts appropriately enough with the very people who were living right next door to this boy's world the entire time, closer than anyone had ever suspected in a story that is about to make the modern map of Europe look a whole lot more complicated than the one hanging on your classroom wall growing up. Here is something most people never get taught in school, and honestly I did not fully understand it myself until I started digging into this story properly. For a long time, the accepted scientific explanation for where modern Europeans came from only had 2 chapters. 2. As if an entire continent's worth of ancestry could be summarized as neatly as a 2-paragraph book report. Chapter 1. Hunter-gatherers. Long before anyone in Europe planted a single seed on purpose, small bands of people already lived across the continent, following herds, fishing rivers, surviving the retreating edges of the Ice Age, in roughly the same resourceful way our earlier Siberian family did. Researchers call this group West European hunter-gatherers, and they were there first by a wide margin for thousands upon thousands of years, before anyone else showed up to complicate the picture. Chapter 2. Farmers. Roughly 8,000 years ago, an entirely different population began arriving in Europe from the direction of the Near East, bringing something the hunter-gatherers had never needed before: agriculture. Wheat, barley, domesticated animals, permanent villages instead of seasonal camps. Researchers call this group early European farmers, and for decades the tidy, comfortable assumption was that basically all of modern European ancestry could be explained by simply mixing these 2 groups together in different ratios depending on where you happen to be born. 2 ingredients, 1 recipe, case closed, or so everyone assumed. Except the math kept quietly refusing to work. A team led by a researcher named Iosif Lazaridis, working alongside the geneticist David Reich at Harvard, decided to actually test that 2-ingredient recipe properly, rather than simply repeating it because it sounded reasonable. Reich's laboratory, by the way, had already built a reputation by this point as the place in the scientific world least willing to accept a comfortable old theory just because everyone had grown used to hearing it. If anything, that particular group of researchers seemed to treat every widely accepted assumption as a personal challenge waiting to be tested with better data. They sequenced the genome of a hunter-gatherer whose remains have been found in Luxembourg nicknamed Loschbohr, roughly 8,000 years old, and compared him against a farmer's genome from Germany nicknamed Stuttgart, roughly 7,000 years old. Then they lined both of those ancient genomes up against genetic data collected from thousands of living Europeans, testing population by population whether a simple 2-way blend of hunter-gatherer and farmer could actually explain everyone. For plenty of southern Europeans it worked reasonably well. But the further north and east the researchers looked toward places like Lithuania, Finland and Russia, the numbers simply stopped adding up. No matter how they adjusted the ratio between hunter-gatherer and farmer, something was consistently stubbornly missing from the equation. A silent 3rd ingredient that nobody had accounted for at all. Picture a baker insisting a cake only ever needed flour and sugar, while a whole section of customers keep quietly complaining that theirs tastes strangely of butter nobody remembers adding. Eventually you stop blaming the customers and start checking the recipe again. Any baker who refuses to check twice frankly does not deserve the kitchen. Here is a question worth sitting with for a second. If you were handed a recipe that only had 2 ingredients listed, and the dish somehow still tasted like it contained a third one you could not quite name, would you trust the recipe, or would you trust your own tongue? Lazaridis and his colleagues chose to trust the data over the tidy old story, which honestly is exactly what good scientists are supposed to do, even when it makes their own previous assumptions look a little embarrassing in hindsight. So they went looking for a third reference point to test. And this is where our story folds back on itself in a way I find quietly thrilling every single time I think about it. They added our small boy from Malta into the equation. Not as a European, not as an ancestor of Native Americans this time, simply as a third possible genetic ingredient sitting there in the data the entire time waiting for somebody to finally include him properly in the recipe. The missing piece fit almost immediately. I want you to sit with the timing of that for a moment. This same small skeleton already responsible for quietly rewriting the story of the Americas just months earlier in a completely different research paper was now being pulled into an entirely separate investigation on an entirely different continent by a research team who, as far as I can tell, were not even primarily looking for him when they started. He kept showing up uninvited in exactly the places the math had a hole in it. Once MA1 was added as a third reference population, the stubborn, unexplainable numbers from Northern and Eastern Europe suddenly resolved themselves cleanly. Nearly every European population tested could now be modelled as a 3-way mixture instead of a 2-way one. Hunter-gatherer, farmer, and a third component related unmistakably to our Siberian boy that researchers officially named Ancient North Eurasian ancestry, using the exact same label already given to the ghost population we talked about connecting to Native Americans. Let that land properly for a second, because I do not think a headline alone quite captures it. The same 24,000-year-old bloodline that helped shape the ancestry of indigenous peoples across 2 entire American continents, also through a completely separate migration route heading the opposite direction, quietly worked its way into the ancestry of modern Europeans. 2 vast, seemingly unconnected populations on opposite sides of the planet, both carrying pieces of the same small forgotten Siberian family without either group ever knowing it until a laboratory in the 21st century pieced it together. Somewhere right now, a person in Warsaw and a person in Winnipeg could sit down at the same table, complete strangers speaking entirely different languages, with no shared culture, no shared history anyone ever wrote down, and both be carrying a measurable trace of the exact same small child buried in ivory beside a Siberian lake. Neither of them would ever have a reason to suspect it. That is not poetry. That is a spreadsheet sitting in a university archive somewhere waiting patiently for someone to notice. Now, before you picture every European walking around today as some kind of equal thirds blend, let me give you the actual numbers, because reality as usual turns out to be more interesting than a clean, tidy split. Ancient North Eurasian ancestry never rises particularly high in Europe. Researchers estimate it tops out somewhere around 20% in most European populations, and it climbs a bit higher, closer to 29% in parts of the Caucasus region, that mountainous stretch of land bridging Europe and the Near East. Early European farmer ancestry, meanwhile, swings dramatically depending on where you look, from roughly 30% up near the Baltic coast, all the way up to around 90% in parts of the Mediterranean. Hunter-gatherer ancestry fills in most of the remaining gap, generally higher the further north you travel. Some of you watching tonight have probably already spat into one of those mail-order genetic testing kits at some point, curious about your own background, and gotten back a report listing percentages for regions with names like Scandinavian or Eastern European, or occasionally buried in smaller print near the bottom something labelled Siberian or North Asian. This is in a real sense exactly what those small percentages are quietly referring to. Not that your great-grandfather personally hailed from Siberia. Something much older, much deeper, and much stranger than that. Folded so far back into the family tree that no living relative could possibly have told you the story themselves, even if you asked every single one of them at the dinner table this weekend. And here is a small twist that truly made me laugh out loud the first time I came across it, because scientists apparently cannot help themselves once they start pulling on a thread like this. It turns out even the early European farmer group is not actually a clean single ingredient itself. The same research team calculated that around 44% of that farming population's own ancestry traced back to yet another even older population, one that had split off from the rest of humanity's family tree so early it predates almost every other branch we know about. Researchers only half joking, I suspect, named this even deeper layer basal Eurasian. It is genetic mixtures nested inside genetic mixtures, like the world's most exhausting set of Russian nesting dolls, except every single doll turns out to be several thousand years older than the last one you opened, and nobody has yet found the smallest doll at the very centre. In plain terms, a person from Northern Europe and a person from Southern Europe today are not simply the same recipe repeated in different portion sizes. They're shaped by honestly different historical proportions of all three ancestral groups, layered on top of each other unevenly across thousands of years of migration, intermarriage, and quiet, unrecorded human movement that no history book from that era exists to describe. A blonde-haired farmer in Sweden and a dark-haired fisherman in Sicily are not opposite ends of some imaginary single European scale. They're two entirely different blends of the exact same three ancient ingredients mixed in wildly different proportions by thousands of years of local history neither of them ever chose or controlled. I think this is the part of the story worth sitting with the longest, honestly. Because if you have ever heard someone confidently describe a particular look, a particular set of features as the pure, original, authentic version of European, I want you to picture Lazaridis and his team quietly running their statistics in a lab, discovering that the very idea of a clean, two-ingredient European ancestry was already wrong, let alone a one-ingredient version. There is no unmixed baseline hiding underneath all of this waiting to be rediscovered. It is layers all the way down farther than anyone had previously accounted for, and probably farther still than we currently understand. Let me ask you something and take your time with this one. If somebody asked you to name your own ethnicity right now, how many generations back do you think you could actually trace it with confidence before the paper trail simply runs out? For most of us, honestly, the answer is somewhere between 3 and 5 generations, maybe on a good day, with a particularly organised relative keeping records. Everything before that is essentially educated guesswork, family legend, or, in most cases, nothing at all. And yet we build entire identities on top of that short foggy window, as if it stretched back unbroken to the beginning of time. I will say this plainly because I think it matters. Claims about ethnic purity in Europe or absolutely anywhere else on this planet do not survive contact with actual population genetics. Not because science has some political agenda to prove a point, simply because every single time researchers have looked closely enough at any population anywhere, the story has turned out to be layered mixed and considerably more interesting than the simple single origin story people sometimes prefer to tell themselves. I bring this up gently, not to lecture anyone watching tonight, but because I think there is something quietly comforting hiding inside this particular piece of science, if you let it be comforting instead of threatening. Nobody gets to claim a longer, purer, more original ticket to belonging on this planet than anyone else. We're all without exception standing on top of the exact same pile of ancient, tangled, well-travelled ancestry. Some of us just happen to know slightly more of the details than others do purely by accident of which record survived and which laboratory happened to get funding first. It is a strange kind of humility, honestly learning that your own ancestry is not a straight line at all, but something closer to a river delta splitting, rejoining and splitting again 1,000 times over before it ever reached you. There is also a small, almost poetic detail buried inside this discovery that I do not want to rush past. The ancient North Eurasian ancestry flowing into Europe likely did not travel there directly from Siberia in one clean journey. Somewhere along the way it mixed first with those original hunter-gatherer populations, forming an intermediate group researchers call Eastern hunter-gatherers, spread across what is now Russia and Eastern Europe, before that combined ancestry ever moved further west and blended into the wider European story we just walked through. Think of it as a layover rather than a direct flight one that happened to last several thousand years and produce an entirely new population of its own along the way. Our boy's bloodline, in other words, took its time. It paused, mingled, formed entirely new communities along the way, and only then kept moving. Which raises a question I cannot stop thinking about myself, and I suspect you might be wondering it too by now. If this one small ancient Siberian population managed to quietly reach two separate continents, blending into peoples as different as Norwegian fishermen and Andean farmers, where on earth did the ancient North Eurasians themselves actually come from originally? Because 24,000 years ago was not the beginning of their story either. It was simply the point where we happened to find the first clear photograph of them, already fully formed, already carrying whatever came before. To answer that, we need to travel even further back and even further north past the boy, past his crown of ivory, into conditions so extreme that for a long time, most scientists confidently assumed no human being could have possibly survived there at all. As it turns out, they were wrong about that too, and the proof would eventually come from a place so cold and so remote that it makes the mammoth steppe we already walk through together sound almost forgiving by comparison. Let me take you somewhere colder than anywhere we've visited so far in this story, and I truly mean that as a warning, not just a bit of dramatic flair. Picture a river called the Yana cutting through the far northeastern corner of Siberia, well above the Arctic Circle, roughly 60 miles from where that river finally empties into the Arctic Ocean itself. If you're picturing somewhere similar to northern Alaska on a map right now, you're more or less in the right neighbourhood except colder and considerably more isolated even by Arctic standards. Most of us will spend our entire lives without ever standing somewhere this remote, this far from another human settlement, this far from help if anything goes even slightly wrong. This is not a place where people were simply passing through on their way somewhere warmer. This is a place people apparently chose to call home generation after generation for a very long time. In 1993, a Russian geologist named Mikhail Dashtzerin was out searching for old animal fossils along the riverbank, the kind of unglamorous fieldwork that rarely makes headlines. He found something unexpected sticking out of the thawing ground. A carved spear point made not from stone but from the horn of a woolly rhinoceros, an animal that has been extinct for thousands of years. It was clearly old. It was clearly made by human hands, and for reasons that happen more often in archaeology than you might expect, budgets, permits, and the simple fact that this stretch of Arctic Siberia is brutally difficult to reach in the first place, nobody quite got around to properly investigating it for almost another decade. It took until 2001 for an archaeologist named Vladimir Pitulko to return to that exact spot guided personally back to the location by Dashzaran himself and finally begin a proper excavation. What Pitulko's team eventually uncovered turned out to be one of the most extraordinary Ice Age sites ever found anywhere on the planet, buried under roughly 30 feet of solid, undisturbed permafrost. Excavations continued there on and off for well over a decade afterward, a testament to just how much history was waiting patiently underneath that frozen ground. Here is why that specific depth matters so much. Permafrost is essentially nature's own deep freezer, and 30 feet of it left completely undisturbed. For tens of thousands of years preserves organic material almost unnervingly well. Materials that would rot away to nothing within a single century almost anywhere else on Earth have simply been sitting there patiently waiting for someone with a shovel and enough patience to notice them. Over the following years of careful excavation, Pitulko's team pulled more than 2,500 individual artifacts out of that frozen ground. Ivory tools, bone needles, delicate personal ornaments, even a tool believed to have been carved from wolf bone. Some of the spear foreshafts recovered were straightened using heat, likely steam, bent carefully back into shape, using techniques that still show up in traditional ivory and bone working today. This was not a brief, desperate pit stop by a handful of exhausted travellers. This was a functioning, resourceful, long-term community living in one of the single harshest environments a human being has ever chosen to call home. The site itself spreads out across several separate locations along the riverbank, suggesting people return to this general area again and again, possibly across many generations, rather than settling once and abandoning it after a single hard winter. Here is a small detail that truly stopped me in my tracks the first time I came across it. Among the ornaments recovered from this site, researchers found beads made from amber, a material that does not naturally occur anywhere near that stretch of the Yana River. Somebody either travelled a significant distance to obtain it personally, or more likely it passed hand to hand through a trade network stretching across a landscape most of us would consider entirely uninhabitable. Before agriculture, before writing, before the wheel, before, frankly, almost everything we tend to associate with organised civilization, there was already a functioning supply chain, moving small, beautiful, completely non-essential objects across an unimaginably brutal stretch of the Arctic, purely because somebody somewhere wanted them. I find that detail almost funny, honestly, in the best possible way. Human beings apparently decided that decorative jewellery was a supply chain priority worth maintaining, before we had figured out permanent housing in warmer regions. Some things, it seems, never really change. Give a person a frozen river, a woolly rhinoceros horn, and roughly nothing else to work with, and they will still somehow find a way to accessorize. It also tells us something a little different from what we learned earlier about the burial at Sunghir, that community who travelled far to find marriage partners and avoid inbreeding. This is not evidence of people travelling. This is evidence of objects travelling past from stranger to stranger, across distances the people who eventually wore them likely never personally walked themselves. Two completely different kinds of connection, both stitched quietly into the archaeological record of the Ice Age, both equally easy to overlook if you're only picturing small isolated bands of people fighting for survival in total silence. Now remember, the small team of scientists we spent time with earlier, the ones who first pulled a readable genome out of our boy from Malta, and who founded that impossibly careful contamination-free laboratory we talked about. That same broader research effort, led once again by the DNA specialists we already met, eventually turned their attention toward this site as well. In 2019, they successfully extracted and sequenced genetic material from the only human remains ever recovered at Yana out of everything Pitulko's team had painstakingly pulled from the ground over more than a decade of digging. Not full skeletons. 2 small milk teeth, the kind that fall out naturally during childhood, belonging to 2 young boys who were not related to each other. Think about the sheer improbability of that for a second. Out of an entire ancient settlement, thousands of artifacts, years of careful excavation, the only human remains anyone ever managed to find were 2 tiny teeth, small enough to lose at a coat pocket, holding inside them the entire genetic record of a lost Arctic people. Have you ever lost a baby tooth as a child yourself, tucked it under a pillow, and never thought about it again for decades? Somewhere out there, one of yours could theoretically survive in the ground longer than every building currently standing on the entire planet. And here is the number that honestly reframes everything we've talked about so far tonight. These 2 boys lived roughly 31,600 years ago. Sit with that for a moment against everything we already know. Our small friend from Malta, the one with the ivory crown, the one whose entire story kicked off this whole journey, lived roughly 24,000 years ago. These 2 boys from the Yana River predate him by well over 7,000 years. 7,000 years is, for context, longer than the entire span of recorded human history, from the first cities of Mesopotamia all the way to tonight. And these 2 children were living successfully north of the Arctic Circle, in one of the most punishing environments this planet has ever produced before that entire span of time had even begun. I like to imagine handing someone from today's world a simple timeline with no labels, just a long blank line, and asking them to guess roughly where organized human settlement in the Arctic might first appear on it. I doubt a single person would guess correctly on the first try. Most of us assume the far north stayed empty until relatively recently, right up until the ice finally started retreating. The Yana site alone pushes that assumption back by tens of thousands of years, and it did not even happen gently. These people were living there during seriously brutal glacial conditions well before the worst of the last glacial period had even arrived. Researchers gave this population its own name, distinct from our Malta family, calling them Ancient North Siberians. Genetic analysis of these 2 boys revealed a population that was roughly 2/3 related to ancient populations further west toward what would eventually become Europe, and roughly 1/3 related to ancient populations further east toward what would eventually become East Asia. In other words, this Arctic community already represented its own ancient blend, its own particular mixture, sitting at what researchers now believe was near the very root of the story our boy from Malta would represent several thousand years later. I want to be honest with you about something here, because I think clarity matters more than sounding impressive. The relationship between these Yana boys and our friend from Malta is still being actively debated by the researchers who study this. Some believe the Yana population is a direct ancestor of the Malta lineage. Others believe they represent parallel, closely related branches, both descending from something even older that split apart before either group existed in the form we found them. Science at this particular edge of discovery does not always hand you a single tidy answer, and I would rather tell you that honestly than pretend otherwise for the sake of a cleaner story. Some researchers now believe ancient North Siberians and ancient North Eurasians are near-related branches, possibly near enough to be considered something like sister populations, both descending from an even older shared ancestor, whose remains have not yet been found, if they still exist to be found at all. One of the principal scientists behind this discovery described these 2 boys in language I have not been able to stop thinking about since I first came across it as an essential missing piece connecting the deep ancestry of Siberia's later peoples with the earliest ancestors of Native Americans. Missing piece feels like exactly the right phrase, honestly. Think back to that shredded document analogy from earlier, the one about piecing together a manuscript from thousands of scattered fragments. If Malta gave researchers a crucial page from somewhere in the middle of that manuscript, these two boys from Yana handed them a page from several chapters earlier, one that helps explain how the story even started in the first place. Let that settle for a second, because it quietly expands everything we covered earlier about our boys' connection to two entire continents. It is not simply that a 24,000-year-old population in central Siberia happened to see two hemispheres worth of modern humanity. There is an even older layer sitting underneath that one further north, further back, and somehow even more resilient than the one we already thought was impressive enough on its own. I want to ask you something honestly, because I think about this a lot. If you were told you had to survive right now above the Arctic Circle, in conditions roughly twice as harsh as anything most of us have ever personally experienced, using nothing but stone tools, animal bone and whatever scraps of trade network you could maintain with distant strangers, how long do you honestly think you would last? I already gave you my honest answer about the Mammoth Steppe a while back. This place would probably finish me off considerably faster. And yet these two boys were not the desperate last survivors of some doomed failing settlement clinging to existence by their fingernails. Their bones show no obvious signs of malnutrition consistent with a starving population. Their community was making art. They were trading for amber, of all things purely decorative amber from hundreds of miles away. They were by every measure available to us simply living, not merely enduring, living in a place most modern humans would consider an active emergency the moment we stepped outside without proper equipment. I think this is worth sitting with for a moment before we move forward, because it quietly reframes something we tend to assume without ever questioning it. We often imagine human history as a slow, steady climb out of misery, starting from some grim, barely surviving baseline and gradually improving generation after generation, until we arrived here tonight warm, comfortable and streaming a video before bed. The people of the Yana River do not fit neatly into that comforting story. They were in their own context already thriving, already trading, already decorating themselves and their children tens of thousands of years before anyone would build the first permanent city anywhere on the planet. There is something almost humbling about that, at least for me. We tend to imagine progress as a straight upward line with comfort steadily increasing the closer you get to the present day. The Yana River community quietly argues otherwise. Human beings, it seems, have been capable of building rich, meaningful, even joyful lives in seriously hostile places for a lot longer than our modern sense of history usually gives us credit for. So if the deepest roots of this story stretch back even further than we originally thought past our boy from Malta, past this Arctic community above the Yana River, the question naturally becomes where all of these scattered resilient threads eventually led. We have already followed one branch west into the story of modern Europe. There is another branch, arguably the most consequential one of all that we have only briefly touched on so far. It leads east, then further east still across a stretch of land that no longer exists on any modern map, a bridge the ocean itself would later swallow whole into a hemisphere that for a very long time nobody outside of it even knew was there. Two entire continents filled with people who would eventually build their own cities, their own empires, their own languages found absolutely nowhere else on Earth, all quietly tracing part of their story back to frozen rivers exactly like this one, somewhere between Siberia and Alaska. On almost every modern map you have ever looked at, there is simply open water. The Bering Strait cold, deep and roughly 50 miles across at its narrowest point. But maps only ever show you the present moment frozen in place, as if it were the only version of the world that ever existed. 20,000 years ago, that entire stretch of water was not water at all, and if you had somehow stood on that spot back then, you would have seen nothing but dry land stretching toward the horizon in every direction. During the height of the last ice age, so much of the planet's water was locked up in glaciers that global sea levels dropped by well over 300 feet compared to today. And when the sea drops, that dramatically entire pieces of ocean floor simply reappear. Where the Bering Strait sits today, there was once a vast sprawling landmass, researchers now call Beringia, stretching for hundreds of miles in every direction, wide enough that describing it as a simple bridge honestly undersells it. This was not a narrow, precarious walkway between two continents. This was practically its own small subcontinent, with its own grasslands, its own weather, its own herds of grazing animals wandering across land that has been sitting underwater for thousands of years now, entirely invisible to every single person who has ever lived since. Here is where the story gets, in my opinion, quietly one of the most fascinating twists in this entire mystery. For a long time, researchers assumed people simply walked across Beringia in a fairly continuous, steady migration, moving from Siberia into the Americas the way you might walk across a long hallway between two rooms, barely pausing to look around. Genetic evidence collected over the past couple of decades tells a considerably stranger story. It suggests a population likely descended in part from the very ancient North Eurasian lineage we have been following all night, moved on to Beringia, and then for reasons still debated simply stopped there. Not for a season, not for a few years. Researchers estimate this population remained genetically isolated on Beringia for somewhere in the range of several thousand years, effectively cut off from both Siberia behind them and the Americas ahead of them before their descendants ever continued moving east. Scientists have given this idea a name that I happen to love purely for how strange and evocative it sounds out loud: the Beringian standstill hypothesis. An entire population quite literally paused in the middle of the map, mixing internally developing genetic characteristics found nowhere else waiting, whether by choice or by circumstance, before finally continuing the journey that would eventually populate two entire continents. Try to picture what that actually would have looked like day to day, generation after generation. Not a single dramatic crossing, the kind you might picture in a documentary reenactment, with a determined family striding purposefully toward a new horizon. Something closer to an extended multi-century layover in a landmass that would eventually disappear beneath the waves so completely that most people today have no idea it ever existed at all. Entire lifetimes were lived and lost on ground that no longer technically exists anywhere on Earth. Ground you could not visit today even if you tried, no matter how much money or determination you brought with you. How many generations do you think it would take before a place like that simply became home, rather than a stopover on the way to somewhere else? 100 years? 500? By the time anyone's descendants finally continued moving east, Beringia was not a waiting room anymore. It was the only world several generations of people had ever personally known. It was somewhere during this standstill, or possibly slightly before it, that ancestry connected to our small friend from Malta folded into the picture. Populations related to the ancient North Eurasian lineage mixed with populations related to ancient East Asians, and that specific combination, that particular blend, is what eventually walked onward into a hemisphere that did not yet have a single human footprint anywhere on it. Every single step those first travellers took east from that point forward was quite literally a step into land no human eye had ever seen before. Not a new country, a new world in the most literal sense that phrase can possibly carry. Let's fast forward now past Beringia, past the standstill, all the way to Montana, in the United States, to the year 1968. A construction crew working on private land near the small town of Wilsall uncovered something nobody expected to find on an ordinary workday. There is something almost darkly comic about it, if I am honest. Somewhere out there, a crew showed up expecting nothing more exciting than dirt, gravel, and the usual grumbling about deadlines, and instead uncovered a discovery that would eventually rewrite an entire chapter of human migration. I imagine that particular Monday morning did not go according to anyone's original plan. Human remains an infant covered in red ochre, buried alongside more than 100 stone and bone tools expertly crafted in a style archaeologists immediately recognized. Clovis technology, named for the distinctive finely worked spear points, first identified decades earlier in New Mexico tools that show up scattered across North America from roughly 13,000 years ago. It remains to this day the only known Clovis burial site ever discovered anywhere out of an enormous scattering of these distinctive stone points found across the continent over the past century. Which means out of every single Clovis site ever excavated, this one small grave on the Anzic family's own land is the only place where archaeologists have ever actually found the person behind the tools, rather than simply the tools themselves left scattered where their owners once stood. The land where this small burial was found belonged to a family named Anzic, and here is a detail about this discovery that I think deserves far more attention than it usually gets. At the time this grave was uncovered, the Anzic family had a daughter, Sarah, who was only 2 years old, far too young to understand what had just been found on the ground she would grow up playing on. Sarah Anzic grew up practically alongside this ancient discovery on her own family's property, and rather than simply becoming a curious footnote in her childhood, a strange story told at family dinners, she went on to become a molecular biologist herself, specializing in genetics long before she ever imagined that career path would eventually loop back around to her own backyard. Decades later, she found herself personally involved in helping analyze the genetic material of the very infant whose grave sat on land she once played on as a little girl. She has since spoken about approaching the work with a sense of personal responsibility most researchers never get to feel toward their subject, treating those small bones less like a distant scientific curiosity and more like an actual member of her own extended, impossibly extended family history. I do not think you could invent a more fitting custodian for a discovery like this one if you tried. It reminds me a little of Gerasimov, the young man we met earlier, who dug up our boy from Malta before ever imagining what science would eventually reveal about him. Some discoveries, it seems, simply attract the right person to look after them decades before anyone involved understands exactly why that person matters. The infant became known in scientific literature as Anzic I, and for years his remains, along with all of those carefully crafted tools, raised a seriously difficult question that archaeologists had been arguing about for decades already. Where did the people who made Clovis technology actually come from? One theory, popular enough at the time to earn its own name, the Solitarian hypothesis, proposed something rather dramatic. It suggested that Clovis tool-making techniques bore a strong enough resemblance to certain stone tools found in Ice Age Europe that the ancestors of Clovis people might have crossed the Atlantic Ocean directly travelling along the edge of the ice sheets from Western Europe, rather than arriving from Siberia at all. Picture small groups of Ice Age Europeans somehow navigating along pack ice for thousands of miles, eventually washing up on the eastern edge of a continent nobody back home even knew existed. It is a bold theory. I will give it that much credit. I want to pause here and give this theory a fair hearing for a moment, because I think it is worth understanding why it gained traction in the first place, rather than simply mocking it after the fact. Certain Solitarian stone tools from France and Spain truly do share some visual similarities with early Clovis points, similar enough that respected archaeologists spent real careers seriously debating the connection. Archaeology, especially in the decades before ancient DNA became widely available, often had to make its best guesses purely from comparing physical objects side by side, without any other way to check the answer. It was in a sense the same limitation Gerasimov faced with our boy from Malta decades before Villeslev's laboratory ever existed to check his work against actual bloodlines. But comparing shapes is not the same thing as tracing bloodlines, and eventually bloodlines became available to check. In 2014, researchers successfully sequenced the full genome of Anzik 1, making him the oldest genetically sequenced individual ever recovered from the Americas at that time. The results were about as clear as ancient genetics ever gets. Anzik 1 carried the same genetic signature connecting back to our friend from Malta that we've been tracing all evening, roughly the same proportion, arriving through the same general migratory route out of Siberia. He showed no meaningful genetic connection whatsoever to Ice Age Europeans, not the faintest overlap that a Solutrean crossing would have left behind if it had actually happened. The Solutrean hypothesis, elegant as it may have sounded on paper, simply did not survive contact with the actual DNA. Sometimes the more romantic theory loses to the more boring one, and I think that is worth remembering the next time a dramatic historical claim starts circulating online without any genetic evidence attached to it. More than that, researchers found Anzik 1 was closely related to indigenous peoples living across Central and South America today, more so than to almost any other population tested anywhere else on the planet. In plain terms, this small child buried in Montana roughly 13,000 years ago was not some unrelated visitor passing through a lone traveller whose bloodline simply dead-ended in the dirt. He belonged to a population directly ancestral to millions of indigenous people living across 2 continents right now tonight while you listen to this. I want to slow down here and say something honestly because I think it matters more than getting every scientific detail perfectly polished. Several Native American tribal members in Montana have understandably expressed concern over the years about researchers analysing ancestral remains without full direct consultation beforehand. That tension is real, it is valid, and I do not think a story like this one should simply glide past it in pursuit of a tidy, satisfying narrative. Science answered an old archaeological question here. It did not automatically answer the separate, equally important question of who gets to decide how a person's remains are studied, and by whom generations after they were laid to rest. To their credit, the researchers involved did eventually work directly with regional tribal representatives on questions of respectful reburial once the genetic work was complete, treating the infant not merely as a data point, but as someone's actual ancestor owed a proper return to the ground. That process, from what I understand, was not simple, and it was not fast. It should not have been either. Some questions deserve to take their time. Here is a question worth sitting with honestly for a moment. If it were your own great-great-great-grandparent buried on land your family still owned, would you want scientists studying their bones even in the name of answering an honest historical mystery? I suspect the answer depends enormously on who is asking how respectfully they ask it, and who actually gets included in that conversation from the very beginning, rather than being informed only after every decision has already been made without them. What the science does make unmistakably clear regardless of how that separate ethical conversation unfolds is this. The thread we have been following since the very first minutes of tonight's story, starting with a small boy buried in ivory beside a Siberian lake, runs in an unbroken line through Beringia through thousands of years of an isolated standstill nobody could have predicted, and directly into the ancestry of millions of indigenous people living across the Americas today. Not a theory borrowed from comparing arrowheads across an ocean. A bloodline confirmed the hard way, one carefully sequenced genome at a time by a woman who happened to grow up on the exact patch of ground where that bloodline was waiting to be found. We have now followed this ancient story west into Europe and east, across an entire vanished landmass into the Americas. 2 continents, Two completely different modern identities, both quietly rooted in the same small, forgotten Siberian family. But there is a third direction. This ancient bloodline travelled one that reshaped an entirely different part of the world, carried not on foot this time, but on horseback, across an ocean of grass most of us have never once thought to picture, sweeping outward with a force that would eventually shape the very languages hundreds of millions of people speak today, including quite possibly the one you're listening to right now. Picture an ocean, except instead of water. Imagine grass stretching from horizon to horizon in every direction, rolling gently under a moving breeze that never really stops. No mountains to break the view, no forest to hide behind. Just an endless rippling sea of green and gold depending on the season, with nothing to stop you from seeing a storm coming from 50 miles away. This is the Pontic-Caspian steppe, a vast belt of grassland spanning parts of modern Ukraine and southern Russia. And roughly 5,000 years ago it became home to a culture that would quite literally change how much of the world speaks. Researchers call them the Yamnaya, a name borrowed from the Russian word for pit, referring to the distinctive style of grave they buried their dead in. The culture itself was first properly identified in the early 1900s by a Russian archaeologist named Vasily Gorotsov, who spent several seasons excavating along the Donets River and noticed the same unusual pit and mound burial pattern, repeating itself again and again across a huge stretch of territory, far too consistently to be a coincidence. Deep rectangular pits the body laid on its back with knees drawn up, dusted in red ochre, then covered over with an enormous earthen mound called a kurgan. Some of these mounds stretched nearly 100 meters across an extraordinary amount of labor, poured into honoring a single important person, visible from a considerable distance across otherwise flat, featureless grassland, almost like a deliberate signal meant to be seen from miles away long after the person inside was gone. Genetically speaking, the Yamnaya represent a fresh combination of ingredients we've already met tonight, plus one new addition. Remember the eastern hunter-gatherers we briefly discussed earlier, that population carrying ancestry connected to our boy from Malta, formed somewhere in the vast stretch of Eastern Europe and Western Russia. Somewhere south of them, in the rugged mountains bridging the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, a separate population had been developing largely in isolation, shaped by an entirely different landscape of narrow valleys and high passes instead of open grassland known today as Caucasus hunter-gatherers. When these two groups mixed likely somewhere along the northern edge of the Caucasus Mountains, the resulting blend became known to researchers as Western steppe herder ancestry, and the Yamnaya culture is its clearest, most consequential archaeological expression. It is worth pausing on how strange that particular meeting must have been. Two populations shaped by completely different environments for thousands of years, one adapted to endless flat grassland, the other to steep mountain terrain, suddenly finding themselves neighbours, then partners, then eventually a single blended people, whose descendants would go on to reshape the genetic map of an entire continent. Have you ever wondered why horses of all the animals humans eventually domesticated ended up changing history quite this dramatically? A domesticated horse does not just carry you faster than walking. It turns a single determined family into a mobile unit capable of covering in a single day distances that would take a farming community on foot the better part of a week. Multiply that advantage across generations, across an entire culture, built around herding and movement rather than staying rooted to one plot of land, and you start to understand why this particular group out of every population living on Earth at the time ended up leaving such an outsized mark on the genetic and linguistic map of the modern world. Here is where this story connects to something you personally interact with every single day, whether or not you have ever thought about it in these terms. Linguists working entirely independently of archaeologists for well over a century had already reconstructed pieces of a language nobody alive has ever spoken, purely by comparing similarities across languages as different as English, Russian, Hindi and Persian. Think about how strange that project actually is when you stop to consider it properly. Nobody has a recording. Nobody has a written text. Researchers rebuilt fragments of an entire vanished language essentially through educated detective work, tracing shared patterns across languages separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, the way you might reconstruct a shattered vase from scattered pieces found in completely different rooms of a house. They called this reconstructed ancestor language Proto-Indo-European, and among the words they carefully rebuilt piece by piece were terms for wheel, for axle, and for horse. This reconstruction existed on paper for decades, essentially a linguistic guess about what a Bronze Age vocabulary must have included long before anyone confirmed it archaeologically. Then archaeologists started digging up actual Yamnaya kurgans and found actual wooden wagon wheels, actual horse remains, actual physical evidence matching almost eerily the vocabulary linguists had reconstructed from language alone decades earlier without ever having seen a single kurgan themselves. In a few, especially well-preserved graves, archaeologists even found complete wooden wagons buried alongside their owners' wheels, and all a rather blunt way of confirming that yes, these particular people really did care enough about their wagons to take them to the afterlife. I like to imagine a modern equivalent, someone insisting on being buried with their car just in case the next world also happens to have terrible traffic and long commutes. Two completely separate academic disciplines working with completely different types of evidence, sitting in completely different departments that rarely spoke to each other, arrived at the same conclusion independently. I find that kind of convergence more convincing than almost any single piece of evidence on its own. When totally different methods keep landing on the same answer, you are probably looking at something real. Around 4,500 years ago, populations connected to the Yamnaya began moving in large numbers out of the steppe and into the heart of Europe. The genetic impact of this movement is frankly staggering. Researchers studying ancient genomes from a culture called corded ware, which appeared across northern and central Europe shortly after this migration began, found that roughly 75% of their genetic ancestry traced directly back to Yamnaya populations. 3/4. Not a cultural influence, not a trading relationship. An actual overwhelming demographic replacement arriving within the span of just a few generations, a speed of change that most societies throughout history never experience even once. To put that in perspective, imagine if 3 out of every 4 people in your own country today could trace the majority of their ancestry back to a single wave of newcomers who arrived within your grandparents' lifetime. That is roughly the scale of transformation we're talking about here, except it happened across an area covering a meaningful portion of an entire continent in an era with no ships, no engines, nothing but horses, wagons, and sheer determination. Now here is the detail that truly unsettled me the first time I understood its full implications, and I think it deserves careful, honest attention rather than a passing mention. Researchers examining the ratio of DNA inherited on the X chromosome compared to the other 22 chromosomes discovered something striking about exactly who was doing the migrating. Because women carry 2 copies of the X chromosome, while men carry only 1, comparing how much ancestry shows up on that particular chromosome versus the rest of the genome can actually reveal the approximate ratio of men to women involved in an ancient migration. A clever piece of genetic detective work that has nothing to do with bones or artifacts at all. When earlier farming populations had moved into Europe thousands of years before, The genetic evidence shows roughly equal numbers of men and women made that journey together, families migrating as families. The Yamnaya expansion looked completely different. The genetic signature strongly suggests this migration was heavily dominated by men. The consequences of that shift show up unmistakably in the Y chromosome record. The genetic thread passed strictly from father to son, the same kind of marker we talked about back when we first met our boy from Malta. Before this migration, European men carried a wide varied mix of different paternal lineages, including one called G2A that had been common for thousands of years, going back to the earliest farming communities. Within a relatively short span of time afterward, that variety collapsed dramatically, replaced almost entirely by lineages called R1A and R1B. This same paternal lineage is now carried by an enormous share of European men alive today, and through later migrations by many men across South Asia as well. I want to be careful and honest with you about what that actually implies, because it is not a comfortable detail to simply breeze past for the sake of a tidy story. A migration this heavily skewed toward men replacing local paternal lineages, this quickly, strongly suggests a process considerably more disruptive than peaceful neighbours, simply relocating and blending in gradually over a few generations. Researchers debate the exact mechanisms, whether it involved conflict, disease, social upheaval, some form of coercion, or some combination. None of us can fully reconstruct from bones and pottery alone, no matter how carefully we study them or how many new laboratory techniques get invented in the years ahead. What the data does make clear is that this was not a gentle migration. It was in the most literal genetic sense a takeover, even if the precise texture of that takeover kind, or cruel quick or slow, remains only partially visible to us this many thousands of years later. Here is a question worth sitting with honestly for a moment. How do you hold two things in your mind at once: that this expansion likely involved real human disruption and hardship for the people already living across Europe at the time, and that it also happens to be the reason so many of us exist in our current form, at all carrying the languages and often the exact paternal lineages that came out of it? History rarely hands us a clean, comfortable moral lesson tied up neatly with a ribbon. Sometimes it just hands you the data and asks you to sit with the discomfort honestly, rather than smoothing it over into something more flattering. I also want to address something directly, because this particular piece of the story has historically been badly abused by people with seriously ugly intentions, and I would rather confront that head-on than pretend it never happened. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the term Indo-European, along with an older, deeply misused word Aryan, was hijacked by pseudo-scientific racial theorists, and later by actual fascist movements, to construct a false hierarchical myth about a superior ancient master race complete with invented maps and imaginary homelands, designed to flatter whatever political agenda happened to be in fashion at the time. I want to be completely unambiguous about this. That interpretation was and remains scientific nonsense built on cherry-picked evidence and outright fabrication in service of a predetermined hateful conclusion. Indo-European describes a language family and a documented pattern of ancient migration, nothing more, nothing less. It has never described a race, a hierarchy, or anyone's claim to superiority over anyone else. Actual population geneticists today, the same researchers whose careful, unglamorous work we've been following all evening, tend to find these old racial myths almost embarrassing in how badly they misunderstood the very data they claim to be interpreting. The actual genetic story we just walked through, a messy blend of steppe herders, Caucasus mountain dwellers, and the same ancient North Eurasian lineage connected to our small friend from Malta, undermines every single version of that old ugly myth far more effectively than simply ignoring it ever could. There was no pure master race striding confidently out of some imagined homeland. There was a complicated, uneven, occasionally brutal blending of very different peoples, none of them arriving anywhere in some untouched original form to begin with. Because here is the thread worth holding on to as we wrap up this particular chapter. The Yamnaya themselves carried a meaningful share of ancient North Eurasian ancestry, inherited through their eastern hunter-gatherer forebears, which means the same small forgotten Siberian bloodline that helped shape the Americas and helped shape the wider ancestry of Europe also rode out across the steppe on horseback, carried inside the very people who spread the ancestor language behind English, Russian, Hindi, Persian, and dozens of other languages spoken by billions of people alive today. 3 separate continents, 3 completely different unfolding stories, each with its own timeline, its own culture, its own particular texture of triumph and disruption. One small, quiet thread running underneath every single one of them, waiting patiently in a Siberian riverbank for over 20,000 years before anyone thought to go looking for it. I do not think I will ever hear the phrase family tree the same way again, after learning how far back and how wide that particular tree actually branches. We have now traced this bloodline about as far outward as geography alone can take us east into the Americas, west into Europe, south and west again across the steppe into Central and South Asia. What remains is something a little more personal, something considerably closer to home for anyone watching this tonight. Because that ancient thread did not simply stop moving once the migrations ended thousands of years ago and the last kurgan was raised over the last chieftain. It kept going. It kept mixing, diluting, resurfacing in unexpected places, occasionally showing up as nothing more than a small curious line item in a mail-order genetic report someone opened over breakfast and did not fully understand. It is still moving right now, quietly inside people you have almost certainly met, possibly inside someone sitting in the very room where you're watching this, and whether you have ever suspected it or not, quite possibly inside you as well. Let's bring this story back down to something you can actually hold in your hands tonight, because everything we have covered so far, fascinating as it is, can start to feel a little abstract if we never once come back to the present, back to something that actually touches your own life directly. Some of you watching right now have almost certainly opened one of those small cardboard boxes at some point, spat into a plastic tube, mailed it off, and waited a few anxious weeks for a report telling you where your ancestors supposedly came from. Most of those reports focus on the big familiar categories: British, Scandinavian, West African, South Asian, categories that fit neatly onto a colourful pie chart and make for an easy conversation at a dinner party. But if you scroll down far enough past the headline percentages, past the parts you probably screenshotted and sent to your family group chat, some of these companies include a tiny easy-to-miss category, labelled something like Siberian, or occasionally, if the company's feeling particularly precise, Ancient North Eurasian. Tonight you finally know exactly what that small forgettable-looking line actually represents, and honestly, I suspect it deserved a bigger font this entire time. But I want to take you somewhere more concrete than a percentage on a screen, because this ancestry is not simply a mathematical abstraction, floating around in old bones filed away in a university database somewhere nobody outside the field will ever look through. It is still right now a living population with a name, a language, and a home address you could technically find on a map if you had the time and the patience for a very long journey into the Siberian interior. Along the middle stretch of the Yenisei River in central Siberia are home to a people called the Kets. There are roughly 1,200 of them left in the entire world, spread thin across a handful of small villages, a population smaller than many high schools in the United States. Right now tonight, somewhere in one of those villages, someone is probably cooking dinner, checking their phone, complaining about the weather, living an entirely ordinary modern life, while quietly carrying inside every single cell of their body the clearest surviving echo of a story that began 24,000 years ago beside a completely different lake hundreds of miles away. Researchers who have studied their genetics closely have found that Kets carry somewhere between 30 and 40% Ancient North Eurasian ancestry, the single highest concentration of this particular bloodline documented in any living population on the planet today. If you wanted to meet the closest living genetic echo of our small friend from Malta, you would in a very real sense need to travel to a handful of small villages along that specific river, not to a museum, not to a laboratory, but to somebody's actual grandmother's kitchen table. Historically, the Kets lived as nomadic hunters and fishers moving through Siberian forest, largely on their own terms right up until the 1930s, when Soviet policy forced them into permanent Russian-style villages, disrupting a way of life that had likely continued in some form for thousands of years before anyone thought to write it down. Long before that, forced settlement disease brought by Russian expansion into Siberia had already cut deeply into their numbers, a familiar, painful pattern, echoed across countless indigenous populations on multiple continents whenever a much larger, better-armed society arrives uninvited. The Kets survived that too, smaller, quieter, but still they're still speaking a language nobody else on Earth can fully understand. Here is the part of this that I find quietly heartbreaking, and I think it deserves to be said plainly rather than tucked away as a footnote. The Ket language spoken by this same small population is the last surviving member of an entire language family unrelated to any other language family on Earth, a linguistic island with no near relatives left anywhere else on the planet. Out of roughly 1,200 Kets alive today, fewer than 200 can still speak it fluently. Most of them older adults, the youngest generation increasingly growing up speaking Russian instead. When those 200 people are gone, an entire branch of human language, one that has presumably been spoken in some form for thousands of years, disappears from the world completely permanently, the way MA1's original spoken words vanished the moment nobody was left alive who remembered them. I want you to sit with that parallel for a second, because I do not think it is a coincidence worth glossing over. The blood of that ancient family survived 24,000 years, carried forward generation after generation, without anyone even knowing it was happening, protected by nothing more than the simple stubborn fact of biology passed on whether anyone valued it or not. Their language, the actual words they might have used, may not survive another 20, protected by nothing at all except the willingness of a shrinking handful of elderly speakers to keep using it in daily life, a fragile kind of survival that depends entirely on human choice rather than biological accident. Now here is a twist to this story that truly surprised me the first time I came across it, and I promise it connects directly back to the Americas we already spent time discussing. Some linguists have proposed a controversial but seriously argued theory that this small, nearly extinct Siberian language might be distantly related to an entire family of indigenous languages spoken across North America called Na-Dene, which includes languages spoken by the Navajo and Apache peoples among others. This theory has a name, the Dene-Yeniseian hypothesis, and it has honestly divided linguists for years, with some finding the shared grammatical patterns and sound correspondences compelling, and others remaining politely professionally skeptical. If this theory holds up, and researchers are still actively debating exactly how strong the connection really is, it would mean the same Beringian standstill population we talked about earlier may have carried not just genes across that vanished landmass, but the deep roots of language itself splitting into two branches that would not hear each other again for well over 10,000 years. Think about what that would actually mean. A grandmother on the Siberian side of that ancient split and a grandmother on the American side might have once spoken dialects of the same mother tongue before an ocean quietly rose up between their descendants and erased any memory of the connection for millennia, leaving nothing behind except faint grammatical echoes that a handful of stubborn linguists are still trying to piece back together today, one verb ending at a time. Let's shift now to something a little more visible, something you could actually see with your own eyes if you happen to meet the people involved. Earlier tonight we mentioned that scientists who studied MA1's remains found signs cautiously incompletely, given how little genetic material actually survives after 24,000 years, that he likely had darker hair, darker eyes, and darker skin than the pale, blonde, blue-eyed image many of us instinctively picture when we imagine an ancient ancestor of modern Europeans. Here is where the story gets, in my opinion, wonderfully ironic. Remember Fontevagora, that related site we mentioned earlier, home to a population closely connected to our Malta family? Among the remains recovered, their researchers examined a young woman roughly 16 years old, at the time of her death, dead centuries before anyone would build a single pyramid anywhere on Earth, and found she likely carried a specific genetic mutation associated with blonde hair. The earliest confirmed evidence of that particular trait found anywhere in the human genetic record so far. In other words, within the very same broad population connected to our darker-featured boy, separated by only a few thousand years and a short stretch of the same river valley, a mutation had already begun, quietly producing something that would thousands of years later become one of the most recognizable physical traits associated with Northern Europe. That specific mutation did not stay confined to Siberia. Geneticists tracking its spread believe it rode westward, attached to ancient North Eurasian ancestry, carried through eastern hunter-gatherers, and eventually through the Yamnaya expansion we spent so much time on earlier, spreading across Europe until it became one of the most common genetic variants on the entire continent. David Reich, one of the most prominent researchers in this exact field, has pointed to this specific migration as the likely explanation for why hundreds of millions of copies of this one gene variant now exist in modern Europeans, a single mutation that started, as far as anyone can currently tell, somewhere along a cold Siberian riverbank, carried forward by a teenage girl none of us will ever know the name of. Sit with the irony of that for a moment, because I think it is one of the most quietly delightful details in this entire story. The population most responsible for spreading blonde hair across an entire continent may not have looked anything like the pale, fair-haired image so many of us automatically associate with deep European ancestry. If you have ever pictured an ancient European ancestor as some Nordic-looking figure with pale skin and light eyes standing heroically on a windswept cliff in a museum diorama, somewhere the actual genetic record suggests you should probably picture someone considerably darker instead, at least a few thousand years earlier in the story. I find something quietly funny, honestly, about how thoroughly nature seems to enjoy contradicting our assumptions here. We build entire aesthetic categories, entire cultural associations, entire questionable beauty standards around physical traits that, when you trace them back far enough, come from directions nobody would have guessed carried by people who often looked nothing like their eventual descendants. Somewhere a marketing team for a shampoo brand featuring a golden-haired model on the bottle has absolutely no idea their entire visual concept traces back to a teenage girl on the banks of a Siberian river who almost certainly never saw the ocean, let alone a bottle of conditioner. This same broad legacy shows up in smaller but still measurable amounts across an enormous stretch of the modern world. Populations across the Caucasus region carry some of the highest concentrations found outside Siberia, and the Americas tucked into those same mountain valleys we mentioned earlier when we first talked about the Caucasus hunter-gatherers joining the story. various populations across South Asia carry a meaningful, well-documented share as well, layered in through the same general steppe migrations we already traced earlier tonight, arriving thousands of years after the original steppe expansion first began. And of course, indigenous peoples across the Americas carry this ancestry more directly and in some cases more heavily than almost anyone else currently alive on the planet, an unbroken thread stretching back to Bringia and beyond. It really is remarkable when you lay it all out like this side by side. A herder in the Caucasus Mountains, a farmer in rural India, a fisherman along the Yenisei River, and an indigenous elder somewhere in the Andes. 4 people who will almost certainly never meet, who may never even hear of each other speaking languages that share no common root. Anyone has ever proven eating completely different foods, practicing completely different traditions, all quietly carrying fragments of the exact same small, forgotten Siberian family inside their own cells right now tonight, without a single one of them necessarily knowing it. Here is a question worth sitting with honestly before we move forward tonight. If you have ever taken one of those genetic tests yourself and noticed a small unfamiliar percentage you did not immediately recognize or understand, what did you do with that information? Did you look it up? Did you simply shrug and move on to the more familiar categories, the ones with flags and recognizable country names attached to them? I suspect most of us skip right past the strange unfamiliar percentages, when really those might be the most interesting lines on the entire page, quietly pointing toward a story considerably older and stranger than anything the bigger, more colourful categories could ever tell you. I will admit something to you honestly. Before I started researching this particular story, I would have skipped straight past a line labelled Ancient North Eurasian myself, assumed it was some kind of rounding error or statistical noise, and gone right back to reading about whichever percentage sounded more exciting. I do not think I will do that again. We have now traced this ancient bloodline across 4 continents through thousands of generations all the way into a living Siberian village, a nearly vanished language, a golden-haired mutation nobody expected, and quite possibly your own genetic report sitting forgotten in an email inbox somewhere. But blood and language are not the only things that seem to have travelled this far. There is one more thread left to follow tonight, quieter than DNA, harder to measure in a laboratory, but just as strangely persistent across every single culture we have visited so far. It shows up not in genomes, but in stories, the kind told out loud around fires, passed down so many times that everyone eventually forgets exactly where they first began, yet somehow oddly keep sounding the same, no matter how far apart the people telling them happen to reside. Go outside on a clear night, sometime somewhere far enough from city lights to actually see the sky properly and find the Big Dipper. Most of you already know roughly where to look, even if you have never thought much about what you're actually looking at. That familiar handle and cup shape sitting quietly overhead, so ordinary it barely registers as remarkable anymore, easy to point out to a child without ever once wondering how old the pointing itself might actually be. Now here is a question I want you to sit with for a moment. What if I told you that the story your grandmother might have told you about those particular stars, whatever version she happened to know, shares a common ancestor with a story told by hunters in Siberia, and a completely separate story told by indigenous communities in North America thousands of miles apart with no contact between them for tens of thousands of years? This is where our story takes its strangest turn yet, because it turns out blood and language are not the only things capable of surviving an Ice Age migration intact. Stories can too, and researchers have recently found a way to actually prove it using tools originally built for an entirely different branch of science. Altogether, borrowed, retooled and pointed at bedtime stories instead of bloodstreams. across an enormous stretch of the ancient and modern world, from Siberian hunter-gatherer communities to indigenous nations across North America, there exists a myth researchers now call the cosmic hunt. The basic shape of the story stays remarkably consistent wherever you find it, almost eerily, so once you start comparing versions side by side, a hunter, or sometimes a small group of hunters, pursues a large animal, usually a bear, sometimes an elk or a deer. The chase becomes so significant, so cosmically important, that the animal and its pursuers are eventually lifted into the sky itself, transformed into the very stars that make up the constellation most of us casually call the Big Dipper, doomed or perhaps blessed to circle endlessly overhead forever. The ancient Greeks told their own version of this story about a woman named Callisto transformed into a bear and placed in the heavens alongside her son, becoming the constellations we know today as the Great Bear and the Little Bear. Various Siberian communities, including groups like the Khanty and the Evenki, tell strikingly similar stories about a celestial bear hunt playing out among those exact same stars, often with small but telling differences. Sometimes 3 hunters instead of 1, sometimes a different reason for the chase beginning in the first place. And astonishingly so do numerous indigenous nations across North America, including peoples like the Iroquois, describing the same basic pursuit, the same transformation into the night sky thousands of miles, and an entire ocean away from where the Siberian versions are told, with no possible direct contact between these two groups of storytellers for well over 10,000 years. Here is where this stops being simply a curious coincidence and becomes something considerably more rigorous. A researcher named Julien Douy had an idea that initially sounds almost too clever to actually work. He proposed treating myths the same way biologists treat genes, building what are called phylogenetic trees, essentially family trees showing how a story likely branched, mutated, and spread across different populations over time, using the exact same statistical methods scientists use to trace the ancestry of a virus, or as it happens, the exact same general approach used to trace the ancestry of our own boy from Malta earlier tonight. Picture it as building a family tree, except instead of comparing DNA letters, you're comparing individual plot details. Does the story feature 1 hunter or 3? Does the chase end with the animal becoming a bear specifically, or some other creature? Does the story include a dog, a weapon, a particular number of pursuers, a specific reason the hunt begins in the first place? Feed enough of these small variations from enough different cultures into the right statistical model, and patterns start to emerge that no single storyteller, no single culture could ever have noticed, simply by comparing their own local version to a neighbour's, the same way no single ancient skeleton could ever have revealed the full shape of a 24,000-year-old migration on its own. When Douy ran these different regional versions of the cosmic hunt through that kind of analysis, the results pointed toward an origin considerably older than anyone had comfortably assumed for a piece of oral storytelling. The pattern of similarities and differences across versions strongly suggested this myth, or at least its earliest ancestral version existed sometime during the Paleolithic period, potentially tens of thousands of years ago, carried along migration routes that line up almost exactly with the same population movements we have been tracing all night through DNA instead of folklore. Let that sit with you for a second, because I do not think a quick mention does it justice. The same general path our small friend's bloodline took out of Siberia, east across Beringia, into the Americas, west into the rest of Eurasia, appears to roughly match the same path this particular story took as well. Genes and stories travelling together, carried inside the same small bands of people, surviving the same impossibly long journey across ice, across a vanished land bridge, across generations who had absolutely no way of knowing anyone would ever be able to check their work this precisely, this many thousands of years later, it makes me wonder what else might have travelled alongside them that we simply have not thought to look for yet. A lullaby, perhaps. A particular way of telling a joke. Some small stubborn fragment of humour or grief that outlived the very language it was first spoken in, quietly reshaping itself, generation after generation, right alongside the DNA and the folklore we already know how to trace. Somewhere out there, an entire category of inherited human behaviour might be sitting in plain sight, simply waiting for the right researcher to invent the right method for noticing it, the way nobody thought to look for ghost populations in our own blood until somebody finally did. Dewey has gone even further with this idea in his research, suggesting that a famous piece of cave art in France, painted at Lascaux roughly 17,000 years ago, might not simply depict a dead or wounded bison, as many art historians long assumed. It might instead be an early depiction of this exact myth. The animal shown not as a hunting trophy, but as a constellation frozen permanently in the sky, rather than lying dead on the ground, its legs positioned in a way some researchers argue matches the layout of specific stars rather than the collapsed posture of a dying creature. Nobody can prove that interpretation with total certainty, obviously, since the artist left no helpful caption explaining their intentions, and the rest of us are left squinting at pigment on limestone, arguing about intent thousands of years after the fact. But it is a truly compelling possibility, and I find something quietly moving about the idea that people were already looking up at that same patch of sky, weaving stories about it before our own boy from Malta was even born, let alone buried. I want to be careful and honest with you here, the same way I have tried to be honest throughout tonight's entire story. Myths, unlike genes, do not copy themselves with anything near perfect accuracy. Every single retelling changes something, sometimes slightly, sometimes dramatically. The way a story shifts a little every time it passes between friends at a dinner table, or gets exaggerated slightly more each time your uncle retells his favourite fishing story at every family gathering for 30 straight years. A bear becomes an elk in one telling. One hunter becomes 3 brothers in another. A dog joins the chase in some versions and simply vanishes in others. The core skeleton of the story survives remarkably well, in fact, but the details drift, mutate, and occasionally transform almost beyond recognition, exactly the way genes themselves pick up small mutations across thousands of generations without losing their fundamental identity. This is not a perfect word for word transmission passed down like a sacred unchanging scripture. It is something closer to a living thing, adapting, shifting shapes slightly with every mouth that carries it forward, and somehow remarkably never quite forgetting where it started. Here is a question worth actually sitting with rather than rushing past it the way we scroll past almost everything else these days. The next time you happen to look up and spot the Big Dipper, and I hope you actually do this sometime soon, rather than simply nodding along right now from under your blankets, try to imagine every single person across an almost unimaginable stretch of time and geography who once looked up at those same 7 stars and quietly told a version of this same story to someone they loved. A grandmother in Siberia, breath visible in the cold air pointing upward for a child who could not yet talk back. A grandfather somewhere in the woodlands of the northeastern United States doing more or less the exact same thing, separated by an ocean, and roughly 10,000 years neither one having the faintest idea the other existed. Possibly, just possibly, someone standing near a fire beside a Siberian lake 24,000 years ago, pointing upward at exactly the same pattern of stars before ivory beads, before a diadem, before any of us existed to hear the story second hand. That is an extraordinary amount of human tenderness repeated generation after generation, purely because somebody kept deciding the story was worth passing on one more time. The cosmic hunt is not the only thread, like the scholars have noticed either. Comparative folklorists studying traditions across Siberia, the Americas, and even parts of India and Scandinavia have pointed out another oddly persistent detail, showing up again and again across cultures with no obvious connection to one another. A guardian almost always described as a dog standing watch at the entrance to the land of the dead, deciding who may pass through and who may not. You find some version of this figure in Norse mythology and ancient Greek stories about the underworld, in the folklore of several Native American nations, and in old Siberian traditions as well. Cultures separated by oceans, mountain ranges, and thousands of years of independent history, all somehow reaching for the same small watchful animal to guard the exact same doorway. Nobody claims this proves a single tidy unbroken story travelled perfectly intact across 20,000 years and 4 continents. But the sheer frequency of that specific detail, a dog specifically guarding that specific threshold, rather than a bird or a wolf or some invented creature unique to each culture, shows up often enough that serious researchers have started asking the same kind of question we've been asking about blood and language all evening. Could this detail too be an echo of something considerably older than any single culture that currently tells it something first whispered around a fire that has long since gone cold? I will admit there is something almost funny about how humbling this particular detail is for me personally. I have spent plenty of nights looking up at that exact constellation, usually while trying to figure out which direction was actually north, without the faintest idea I might be looking at one of the oldest continuously told stories our species has ever produced quietly, surviving for longer than writing, longer than agriculture, possibly longer than most of the languages currently spoken on this planet. I feel almost embarrassed on behalf of every camping trip where I pointed at those stars and said, absolutely nothing more interesting than, yep, that is the Big Dipper, before immediately changing the subject to whether we had brought enough marshmallows. Somewhere out there, an actual professional folklorist is quietly building a spreadsheet more thorough than most family genealogy projects, tracking exactly how many hunters appear in each regional version of this myth, exactly which animal gets chased in which culture, treating grandmother's bedtime story with the same rigorous statistical care a biologist gives a strand of ancient DNA. I happen to find that combination, the tenderness of a bedtime story and the precision of a laboratory, quietly one of the most beautiful things this entire field of research has produced. We have now followed this ancient thread through blood, through language, and through story itself. 3 completely different types of evidence, 3 completely different academic disciplines, geneticists, linguists, and folklorists, none of whom set out that morning to prove the same thing all quietly, pointing back toward the same small cold riverbank in Siberia. When 3 separate fields of research using 3 separate methods, working with 3 separate kinds of evidence, all arrive at roughly the same map, I think that map deserves to be taken seriously. There is only one place left for this particular journey to end, and it is the place where we actually began tonight, beside that same small fire, next to that same small boy, though I suspect you will understand that beginning quite differently now than you did at the very start of this story. What looked back then like a simple quiet burial is about to look like something else entirely. Let's go back to the fire. Not metaphorically this time, I mean it literally. Close your eyes for a second if it helps and picture it exactly the way we first described it tonight. Snow in every direction. A small flame working hard against a cold that would kill most of us within hours. A community gathered near breath visible, grieving a child who would never grow older than 4. Somewhere behind them, mammoth bone walls. somewhere above them more stars than most of us will ever see clearly again. In our lifetimes, city lights having long since stolen that particular view from almost everyone listening to this story tonight. At the very start of this story, that scene was simply sad. A quiet, private tragedy, the kind that has happened countless times across countless human lives, in countless places long before anyone thought to write anything down, and countless times since, in ways that have nothing to do with the ice or mammoths at all. A small boy wrapped in an ivory crown, given a necklace someone spent days carving by hand, laid to rest beside a small bird pendant, as if it might carry something upward on his behalf. You already know now that it was never simply that. That small private moment of grief turned out to be one of the most important events in the entire genetic history of our species, and none of the people standing around that fire had the faintest idea. They were not making history. They were simply loving a child they had lost the same way people have loved and lost children in every single century since in every single corner of the world. And yet somehow, without meaning to, without any possible way of knowing it, they preserved a message that would eventually reach nearly every continent on Earth. Think about everything that message ended up carrying once scientists finally learned how to understand it properly, decades after a young man barely out of his teens first knelt in that riverbank, with nothing but a small brush and an enormous amount of curiosity. It travelled east across a vanished stretch of land now sitting quietly under the Bering Strait, through a standstill that lasted longer than most civilizations have ever managed to survive, into the ancestry of millions of indigenous people across 2 entire American continents. It travelled west quietly, becoming the missing third ingredient in the ancestry of modern Europeans, the piece nobody even knew was missing until the math simply refused to work without it. It rode out across an ocean of grass on horseback carried inside the people who spread the ancestor language behind English, Russian, Hindi, and dozens of other languages spoken by billions of people tonight. A migration heavy enough to rewrite an entire continent's family tree in the span of a few short generations. It survives today more concentrated than anywhere else on Earth, inside a small community of just over 1,000 people, still speaking the last surviving fragment of an entire vanished language family along a river most of us will never visit. And somewhere in the story it carried with it, unmistakably, is the shape of a myth still being told quietly, under the exact same stars by people who have never met and never will bear forever, chased across the same patch of sky by hunters who have long since become constellations themselves. One small boy, one quiet grave. 4 continents, 3 separate scientific disciplines, and a bloodline running underneath borders and oceans and languages that all came along thousands of years after he was already gone. Before we wrap up the story completely tonight, I want to take one more moment for the people who actually made all of this possible, because I do not think their part in the story gets nearly enough credit once the headlines move on to the next discovery. A teenage boy in Siberia, barely into his own career, who noticed something unusual in a riverbank nobody else had bothered to look at twice. A sculptor of the dead who spent decades giving faces back to skulls, never once suspecting the answer to his own boy's deepest mystery would come from a science that did not exist yet in his lifetime. A geneticist who spent his youth as a fur trapper before ever setting foot in a laboratory, willing to trust strange, uncomfortable data even when every instinct told him to assume contamination instead. A researcher who spent months quietly hoping her own exciting discovery would turn out to be wrong purely so she could be certain it was actually right. A little girl who grew up playing on the exact patch of land where her own distant relative had been sleeping for 13,000 years, and grew up to help him speak again. None of these people set out that morning to rewrite the story of human migration. They were simply doing careful, patient, occasionally unglamorous work, one small piece at a time, and somehow, together across nearly a full century, they gave a nameless child his voice back. Here is what I keep coming back to the longer I sit with this whole story. We spend an enormous amount of energy as a species drawing lines. This nationality, not that one. This ethnicity, not that one. This side of a border, not that one. Sometimes a border that did not even exist 100 years ago, let alone 24,000. We build entire identities, sometimes entire conflicts, entire wars around distinctions that feel in the moment as solid and permanent as bedrock worth defending, worth dying for, worth building a lifetime of assumptions on top of. And then a 24,000-year-old child buried by people who could not have imagined any of our modern categories even existing, who never once heard the words country or race or nation, quietly reminds us that every single one of those lines is astonishingly recent, drawn on top of something far older, far messier, and far more shared than any of us tend to admit in casual conversation. I'm not telling you tonight that differences do not matter, or that culture, language, and identity are somehow meaningless, just because we all share some ancient root buried far enough back in the family tree. That would be a cheap, lazy conclusion, and honestly, this story deserves a more honest one than that. Culture matters. Language matters, as we spent a good portion of tonight discussing. The specific hard-won identity a community builds for itself over thousands of years of its own particular history matters enormously, and none of that gets erased by a shared ancestor sitting somewhere far back in the family tree, waiting patiently in a frozen riverbank for somebody to finally notice him. What this story actually offers, I think, is something a little more modest and a little more useful than a simple slogan about how we are all the same underneath. A gentle evidence-backed reminder that the border between us and them, whoever them happens to be for you personally, is almost always thinner, newer, and more arbitrary than it feels from the inside, no matter how convinced we become otherwise. If you did nothing else with tonight's story except remember that one thing, I think it would already be worth the time you spent here with me. Next time a headline, a stranger online, or even a well-meaning relative at a holiday dinner tries to draw a hard, confident line between your kind of people and someone else's kind of people, I hope some small part of you quietly pictures a little boy in an ivory crown 24,000 years old, patiently undermining that entire argument from a museum shelf in St. Petersburg. I want to say something directly to you now if you have made it this far into the story, because I do not think that is something to take for granted, not for a single second. Somewhere between that first small fire beside a Siberian lake and this exact moment, you and I spent nearly 3.5 hours together tonight. You let a stranger's voice fill your room, while the lights went dim, while the rest of the world outside kept spinning, without either of us paying much attention to it, phones face down, notifications ignored for one of the very few stretches of your day when that is probably true. That is not a small thing. Attention is about the most valuable thing any of us actually has to give another person, more valuable than money, more valuable than most gift you could wrap and hand someone, and you gave a good portion of yours to a story about a child who died 24,000 years ago. I do not take that lightly, and I hope wherever you are tonight, whatever brought you here, whatever kind of day led you to this exact video at this exact hour, whether it was curiosity, insomnia, or simply the algorithm being unexpectedly kind to you for once, that this story gave you something worth that time in return. A little wonder, maybe. A little perspective on your own place in something much larger than yourself. Hopefully, at the very least, a decent night's sleep waiting for you right around the corner, now that your mind has had a few hours to drift somewhere far away from whatever was keeping you up in the first place. Thank you honestly and sincerely for spending tonight with me. Out of every single thing you could have chosen to fall asleep to tonight, every show, every playlist, every mindless scroll through your phone one more time before finally putting it down, you chose to spend a few hours with a small nameless boy from Siberia and the strange, sprawling, beautiful story of everyone he turned out to be connected to. I truly hope that choice felt worth it by the time we reached this final moment together. If this story is the kind of thing that means something to you, quiet, strange, deeply human stories pulled carefully out of the deep past, I would love it if you stuck around for the next one. There are so many more small forgotten people like our boy from Malta, scattered throughout the historical and archaeological record, each one holding onto a piece of a story, just as strange, just as unexpected, just as quietly connected to who we all are today, simply waiting for someone patient enough to go looking. I intend to keep finding them one careful excavation at a time, one overlooked genome at a time, and I would be honestly glad to have you here again when I do. If you've made it all the way to this very last moment of tonight's story and you found even a small piece of it worth your time, I would love to hear which part stayed with you the most. Maybe it was the boy himself dressed like a small king for a journey nobody around that fire could have possibly understood. Maybe it was the Ket still speaking a language nobody else on Earth can understand, holding on to the last thread of something the rest of us let slip away centuries ago. Maybe it was simply the strange comfort of realizing how connected we all secretly are underneath everything that usually keeps us feeling apart, every border, every language, every argument that seemed so important this morning. Whatever it was, I look through every single comment and I would love to know I am not the only one who will be thinking about a small ivory crown long after the lights go back on tomorrow morning. For now though, let's leave our boy exactly where his people first laid him. Ivory crown resting gently in place, beaded necklace catching whatever faint light manages to reach that quiet corner of a museum in St. Petersburg tonight. Small carved bird beside him, wings slightly open, still pointed upward after all this time as if it never once stopped waiting to carry something forward. 24,000 years behind him, and somehow, impossibly, still very much a part of the people listening to this story right now, in the dark on the edge of sleep, carrying a little piece of him forward without ever having to think about it at all, the way you carry your own grandmother's laugh or your own father's stubbornness without ever once consciously choosing to. He never knew any of us would exist. He never knew his small private act of being loved enough to be buried in ivory would end up mattering to a stranger listening to a video generations and continents away from anything he could have possibly imagined. And yet here we are all these thousands of years later, still telling his story, still finding new reasons to remember a boy who never once got the chance to grow up. I think that is its own kind of quiet immortality, honestly. Not fame, not a name carved into stone somewhere for tourists to photograph. Just the simple, stubborn fact of being remembered, being studied, being loved enough by strangers, separated from you by an unimaginable stretch of time that they keep coming back to your story, night after night, unwilling to let you simply disappear into the cold ground, the way everyone else from your era eventually did. Sleep well tonight, and I will see you again soon for the next story.